Okay, I think we will begin. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, esteemed panel members, fellow city bar members, colleagues, and guests joining us today. Welcome and happy International Women's Day. My name is Sheila Boston, and I am the president of the New York City Bar Association. And it is with great pleasure that I welcome you to our second annual International Law Conference on the Status of Women. I first just want to say that I hope that each of you are healthy in both mind and body, and I hope that you're in good spirits, full of optimism. I know that I sure am. And that is why I have declared that the New York City Bar Association, at least for my 2-year presidency, is hashtag Bar of Hope. Our association, which was founded in 1870 and has 25,000 members, including many from all around the world, is dedicated to equipping and mobilizing a diverse legal profession to practice with excellence, promote reform of the law, and uphold the rule of law and access to justice in support of a fair society and the public interest in our community, our nation, and throughout our world. Some of our most significant international work, including the promotion of critical dialogue between legal institutions and governments, is led by our United Nations Committee. And we are so grateful to the committee and its chair, Clayton Chaney, along with the co-sponsoring committees and organizations for convening this important program today. The status of women is a topic near and dear to my heart, and it's an important focus of our association. I am proud to be the first woman of color and only the fifth woman to lead this organization in its 150 years of existence. 3 of those women have served as president in just the past decade. Our association's board of directors is 50% women, and our senior staff is over 50% women. Several of our committees have long been active in supporting the rights of women. These include our Domestic Violence Committee and our Sex and the Law Committee, once chaired, by the way, by none other than the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Through the work of our various committees, we have recently advocated the vacating of trafficking convictions and the application of human rights law to pregnancy, childbirth, and related medical conditions, and shone the light on alleged medical abuses of detained immigrant women. Our Immigration and Nationality Law Committee has called for an end to the use of detention for immigrant children and families. And just last week, I convened a program that I conceived on the over-policing of Black girls in schools. It was the first program of my presidential series, which will focus on issues affecting Black women and girls. Now, internationally, for years, we have increased awareness of and advocated on behalf of human rights lawyers and defenders like Nasrin Sotomayor. And I hope I said her name correctly. Sotomayor, I'm not sure. Please forgive me if it is incorrect. And some of the work of our Cyrus R. Vance Center for International Justice is directly relevant to the 2 panel discussions you will be hearing today. A recent Vance Center report addresses how governments and civil society in Latin America have addressed an increase in domestic violence and the pandemic. And the Vance Center has created the first ever global network of advocates for women in prison, with participants in 21 countries representing every continent. One of their findings is the prevalence among these prisoners of economically disadvantaged young women with caretaking responsibilities, many of whom have committed petty offenses to meet their family's basic needs. Many have suffered domestic violence prior to entering prison and experienced re-traumatization at the hands of police and prison officers. Further, it appears that the current COVID-19 pandemic has only exacerbated these issues. All this work, like the panels about to take place, are especially exciting for me because they intersect with 3 of the pillars of my agenda for my presidency, including diversity, equity, and inclusion, access to justice, and protection of the rule of law. They're all interrelated, aren't they? And you really can't have one without the others. Now, I'm an optimist by nature. Even more so, I'm an optimist by choice. That is why I call the association the Bar of Hope. I don't know, I just feel like something's in the air. The times, they are a-changing. We had hashtag Me Too, hashtag Time's Up. We have our first female vice president in the United States and first vice president of color, Kamala Harris. We see that might no longer automatically makes right. We see in our daily headlines, young women speaking truth to powerful men. And did you see the article in the New York Times last week on how women are on the front lines in the Myanmar protests? The article quotes Dr. Mimi Win Bird, a Burmese American who served as a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army and is now a professor at the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Honolulu. She said, quote, "Even though these are dark days and my heart breaks with all these images of bloodshed, I'm more optimistic because I see women on the street. In this contest, I will put money on the women. They are unarmed, but they are true warriors." Good call, Dr. Bird. For no one should mistake women as weak. Can I get an amen on that? Now, when we stand together and with their allies, we are strong. We are victorious. Finally, how appropriate it is that this program is taking place on International Women's Day. I note that this year's campaign theme is Choose to Challenge, and I would say that theme is well chosen indeed. As they write on their website, we can all choose to challenge and call out gender bias and inequality. And if you visit their website, you'll see a video by a wonderful young spoken word poet named Anissa Nandula. Gender is a pre-written book, she says, but this is your chance to add your own chapter, to call out racism and sexism and use courage to rub it out. Your action is the pen and your life is the paper. End of quote. How profound. Well, to that again, I just say amen, amen, and amen. Let's have a great conference, everyone. I'm so excited to hear our panelists. And at this point, I'm going to turn over the virtual stage to none other than our UN committee chair, the one and only Clayton Chaney.
Thank you, Sheila. And thank you to the staff at the City Bar for all of their hard work in making this conference happen. My name is Clayton Chaney. I am the chair of the City Bar's United Nations Committee. I would like to welcome you all to the second annual International Law Conference on the Status of Women. The City Bar and the United Nations Committee are extremely excited about today's event, which is being held on International Women's Day and is leading up to the 65th session of the Commission on the Status of Women being held later in March. Last year, we were fortunate enough to hold the first annual International Law Conference on the Status of Women in person at the City Bar, which was one of, if not the last in-person event that was held at the City Bar prior to the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. I want to thank all of the exceptional panelists we have joining us today. Their insights and expertise will allow for engaging discussions throughout the conference. I would like to thank our co-sponsoring City Bar committees, including the International Law Committee, the International Human Rights Law Committee, and the African Affairs Committee. I would also like to thank the organizations that co-sponsored this conference, including ECPAT USA, Soroptimist International, the New York State Bar Association's Women in Law section and its President's Committee for Leadership Development, the City Bar Justice Center, and the Vance Center for International Justice. Last and certainly not least, I would like to extend a special thank you to the financial sponsors of today's event, the Huntington National Bank, Epic Global, and Bernstein, Litowitz, Berger, and Grossman. This event would not be possible without their support. These sponsors also sponsored the conference last year, and we look forward to working with them in this conference for many years to come. A couple of administrative issues before we move on to our first panel. We would welcome questions from the audience throughout the conference, and we hope we have time to get to everyone's question. If you would like to submit a question, please use the question and answer tab at the bottom of your screen to submit a question. We ask that you identify yourself and your affiliation when submitting questions. The first and second panels will be followed by short 5-minute breaks before the next section begins. And the conference will conclude with a brief award ceremony to recognize the accomplishments of our speakers and their organizations. The first panel will focus on understanding and mitigating the disproportionate impact the COVID-19 pandemic has had on women and girls. This is a topic that I believe has received far too little attention over the past year. The pandemic has exacerbated and highlighted existing tensions within societies, and this has been evident with regard to gender inequality and discrimination. I hope this panel allows us to better understand this issue and how we can address the structural causes of this inequality and discrimination. With that, I would like to briefly introduce our panelists. Their full distinguished biographies can be found in the conference brochure. Taina Bien Aim is the Executive Director of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. In addition to an accomplished career in international corporate law, Taina has been involved for more than 20 years with Equality Now, an international human rights organization that promotes the human rights of women and girls. Welcome, Taina. Beata Andres is the Special Representative to the United Nations and the Director of the International Labor Organization's Office for the United Nations. She has worked extensively on the issues of forced labor, human trafficking, modern slavery, and child labor, including by playing a key role in launching Alliance 8.7, a multi-stakeholder partnership to end forced labor, human trafficking, modern slavery, and child labor in line with the Sustainable Development Goal 8.7. Welcome, Beata. Her Excellency, the Honorable Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Rwanda to the United Nations, Valentine Rugwabiza, has worked for more than 30 years on African and global development issues in both the private and public sectors. She has served in a host of positions representing the Rwandan government, and she was the Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization in Geneva from 2005 to 2013. She is a founding member of several organizations, including the Rwanda Women Entrepreneurs Association and the Rwanda Women Leaders Caucus. Welcome, Ambassador Rugwabiza. Taina, I would like to turn to you first. I was hoping that you could give us an overview on how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted the susceptibility of women and girls to commercial and sexual exploitation. And should we be viewing commercial and sexual exploitation as a form of gender-based violence?
Thank you so much, and greetings, Excellency, and all the guests at this wonderful conference. Happy International Women's Day, and special thanks to Sheila, to Catherine, to Clayton, of course, and to the City Bar for this extraordinary opportunity to share a few thoughts. So yes, these are burning questions that you're asking, Clayton. But I think before I go to the specifics as to the direct impact of COVID and what the pandemic has done on with respect to violations against women and girls, first I always want to bring the fierce New Yorker Eleanor Roosevelt into the room. Because not only was she an amazing New Yorker, but she's also the architect of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the reason why I always talk about human rights, the Declaration, and I recommend that everybody reads it, is that it's the first international codification, actually any codification where member states came together and agreed that every human being, by virtue of his or her birth, have inherent dignity and have equal and inalienable rights. And the three elements that are always important for us, especially in our work to end violence and discrimination against women and girls, is the concept that human rights are indivisible, inalienable, and universal. So no state can take them away, can take your rights away. You can't consent to having your human rights removed. And the indivisibility of human rights is really key in what we do, because it is such a difficult concept to embrace at a sociocultural legal level when it comes to addressing the rights of women and girls. In terms of nitty gritty, there are 7.8 billion people in the world today. 51% are women and girls. 1 in 3 women and girls experience physical or sexual violence in their lifetime, most frequently by an intimate partner. So that is a lot of women and girls. The United Nations has said that violence against women and girls is one of the most widespread, persistent, and devastating human rights violations that impacts all aspects of a woman and girl's life, psychological, sexual, um, etc., and more often than not with impunity. So within the context of trafficking, we have to, and I love the introduction that was given by the president, Sheila, because our work is really a dance between the law and hope, between grassroots activism and states implementing laws and creating platforms that allow every human being, especially women and girls, to reach their full potential without violence and discrimination. So in terms of sterling law, the Palermo Protocol, which is the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children, give us the internationally recognized definition of human trafficking. And I think it's really important. I won't go into the details of the Palermo Protocol here, but the United States has been has ratified the protocol, and therefore it should be domesticated. Unfortunately, that is not the case. But what is important, the main takeaways of the Palermo Protocol is that one, trafficking does not require movement. We still believe if you go out on the street, if you talk about human trafficking, people are still very confused about whether or not someone needs to have come from another country into the United States to be trafficked. That is not the case. The means are very important. There are a number of means, right? So you have act, purpose, and means of exploitation. The means that we will focus today on are abuse of power and abuse of vulnerability, because it's the vulnerabilities exist, and what COVID-19 has done is really aggravate those vulnerabilities. And then another element that is key for us is that consent is irrelevant to one's exploitation. A lot of times we talk about consent within the context of trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation within the context of consent, but we can talk about that more in the Q&A of how irrelevant that is. So when we talk about vulnerabilities, especially when it comes to women and girls, we're looking at obviously sex and gender inequalities, economic inequalities, but also harmful cultural practices that would include female genital mutilation or child marriage in this country, foster care system, sexual violence in childhood, poverty and homelessness, belonging to marginalized groups, debt bondage, and displacement, whether it's from natural disaster or conflict or war. So the question about the impact that COVID-19 has had, again, is a question of the vulnerabilities and how our system is holding up, addressing these vulnerabilities. And what we're finding is and this even UN Women has found, is that the impact of crises in general are never gender neutral. And COVID-19 is no exception. So with the COVID-19 pandemic, what we're seeing, unfortunately, is really a regression of the limited gains that we've made in protecting the rights of women and girls. I mean, I'm assuming, since I'm speaking to the City Bar, that we're all readers of the New York Times, and even from home, there have been a series of articles on the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on mothers at home who had to leave their work, or who were saddled with the burdens of childcare plus their workload, et cetera, and the economic impact to that. So just imagine a population that is being exploited, that is being highly vulnerable in terms of exploitation and what that does. So traffickers and exploiters are very, very creative. And so in the era of COVID-19, most of the criminal activities have moved online, taking advantage of the increased time people have at home, they're connected at home, and especially targeting children, I have to say. Traffickers have integrated technology into their business models at every stage, from recruiting to exploiting victims. Many children are approached by traffickers on social media. And so the identification of trafficking has been very difficult. Even the UN Office on Drugs and Crimes, UNODC, which is the guardian of the Palermo Protocol, is also finding that trafficking victims are under good circumstances exploited in illegal, informal, unregulated sectors. And now with the restrictions on movement, the closing of borders, what we are seeing is this massive, this exponential increase of targeting vulnerable people, especially women and girls, women and children online. So just to give you a few examples before I end. So according to Google Analytics, and we have to bring in the concept of pornography, right? Because when we talk about the sex trade, it's a very broad spectrum. It's not just street prostitution and brothels and illicit massage parlors and escort services, and the list goes on, but it's also, pornography is also part of this multi-billion-dollar industry of commercial sexual exploitation. So Google Analytics has found that porn searches have skyrocketed by 4,700% since children have been out of school. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has seen an explosion in reporting to their cyber tip line, with an increase of 98.60% in online exploitation. This was from January to September 2020 versus the same time in 2019. So those numbers have even increased. And then if we go around the world, for instance, in Australia, the federal police received more than 21,000 reports of child sex abuse in the 12 months to June 30th, which is an increase of 7,000 cases. UNICEF has reported that 10 million additional girls are at risk of child marriage because of COVID-19. Sexual violence, abuse, sexual exploitation are obviously all consequences of gender inequality and vulnerability. It also has a catastrophic effect on girls in refugee camps. And the list goes on. When we talk, we are primarily an advocacy group. When we talk to our partners who are in direct service provisions, such as Sanctuary for Families or the Empower Clinic that works with trafficked individuals, or Covenant House or Courtney's House in Washington, D.C., they are at capacity. They cannot take any more victims. Their resources are diminished just by the demand for services. So I will stop here. I think that we can talk further about what the solutions are. We're seeing a light at the end of the tunnel in terms of this pandemic. And so we have every faith that we can get back on track, but it's critically important to remind ourselves that these vulnerabilities have exacerbated in the lives of women and girls. And so there is an urgency to address them in the most comprehensive and holistic way with every tool we have in our arsenal. So thank you.
Thank you, Taina. And you know, I do hope that the latter part of this panel can be devoted to discussing solutions and how we address these problems. And I know you did touch a little bit on what your organization focuses on, but I was hoping just to briefly follow up with you and get kind of an overview of your organization's work. And you described how exploitation has changed during the pandemic, and I'm wondering if your organization has kind of had to change how they do their work or the types of things that they've been focused on.
Well, I think like we're a very small nonprofit organization, so clearly we are affected by COVID-19 like everyone else. We haven't been in the office in a year, and so there are those challenges. But I don't think we've ever been as busy as we have been in the last year. You know, we're primarily a legal advocacy organization. We raise awareness about these issues, but our job primarily is to hold governments at the local, state, national, federal, international level to hold them accountable to the laws that they have enacted when it comes to ending trafficking and sexual exploitation or any other form of sexual violence or discrimination against women and girls. And that has been challenging. You know, I think as advocates, it's always, as I mentioned, it's a tug of war with governments, right? Because on the one hand, they most governments want to be good members of the community, whether it's a national community or the international community. And so I think that the political will to enact at least strong laws is there. But then right now, what we're facing especially at the New York City level, I would say, and the federal level, is the state failing women and girls at all levels, or at least I would say going back to the Declaration of Human Rights concept of indivisibility, not understanding what indivisibility for women's rights means. So I'll be very specific. And I asked Clayton permission as to whether I can actually speak my mind or be more diplomatic. And so since you said I could do the former, here it is. So in February of this year, February 15th to be specific, New York State legalized reproductive commercial surrogacy, right? So, and this was done, actually the law passed last year in the middle of the night on April 2nd. And it was a law that was buried in a 400-page budget that New York State and all of its districts desperately needed to be signed. And so for 2 years, a number of us, there was a letter that was sent to Governor Cuomo, signed by over 100 New York women leaders, just urging him not to enact a law that would increase the vulnerabilities of the most marginalized women and marginalized mothers. And so unfortunately, the law passed. And so here we're in this state that has committed to ending or at least addressing maternal mortality. And we know Black women in particular have 2 to 3 times higher risk of maternal mortality than white women. Here we are saying that we want equality for women and girls, but then on the other hand, if there is an exchange of money for that exploitation of vulnerability, then all of a sudden, all of our principles of equality or protection go out the window. And so, and you know, I won't go into too many details about the law, but it is it claims to be highly protective to surrogate mothers, but it really is a bill that protects the reproductive technology industry and the contractors. There's not even a registry that would follow a woman's health, whether she's an egg donor or a surrogate mother. So these are situations where it was definitely not on my checklist of things to do when you work on issues of trafficking and sexual exploitation, to all of a sudden have to challenge and address your own state. I work primarily at the international level, and so and we work with a very vibrant global survivor-led movement. So these issues are you know, very disturbing, so to speak. And the question is, how many women will have to die in New York State before we revisit this commercial surrogacy law? I don't know. And then the other part, which is also from the microcosm to the macro, and that is in New York City, there are many elections right now, from the New York City Council to the mayoral elections. The district attorney's office in Manhattan, and a number of candidates, unfortunately, are calling for the legalization or the decriminalization of the sex trade. And so when you go back to the Palermo Protocol and you look at the concept of abuse of power and abuse of vulnerability for profit, right? We're talking about a system of exploitation that is for the profit of a few. And when you look at, again, all the vulnerabilities and you add to that, especially within the context of our history in the United States, the legacy of slavery and the commodification of Black women's bodies in particular, and our histories of colonialism, and for our candidates to all of a sudden not fully understand what a fully decriminalized sex trade would mean to New York City or New York State is something that is of deep concern to us. And so that is what we've been doing. So I've stopped traveling every 3 weeks, but instead have been focusing at home and trying to prevent what other countries have been fighting for the last 20 years with tremendous progress. And now we're seeing an absolute regressive stance at home under the guise of so-called progressive politics. So thank you.
Thanks, Taina, and I'm glad that you felt comfortable to speak your mind. And please do keep up the important work you're doing and your organization is doing. With that, I'd like to turn to Beata, and thank you for being here this afternoon. I was hoping that you could give us, from more of an economic perspective, how the pandemic has impacted or disproportionately impacted women and girls, and kind of identifying some of the structural inequalities that exist that have been exacerbated by the pandemic.
Thank you so much, Clayton, and thank you to the New York City Bar Association for inviting the ILO to this very important discussion. I would like to also greet my fellow panelists, Ambassador Ugbabiza, of the Ambassador of Rwanda to the UN, as well as Taina Bien-Aimé. It's a pleasure really meeting you virtually. Taina, a lot of what you said really resonates with me because, as Clayton mentioned, I've worked on trafficking for many, many years, but I will focus on the economics as I was asked to do. I'd also like to greet President Sheila Boston. Your introductory remarks were truly inspiring and I admire your optimism. I will also finish on a positive note, but allow me to share some data which actually paints, unfortunately, a rather bleak picture of where we are today on this International Women's Day. So clearly, the past year has been challenging on everyone, working women, working men, everyone. However, it is also clear, and it has become a common saying now, that women paid a higher price. So let me just refer to 4 main points here, why we think women actually have been disproportionately hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. So if you look at employment, even before the COVID-19 pandemic, women's participation in the labor force, globally speaking, was much lower than men's. It stood at 45%, 45% of women working compared to 70% of men in the labor force. So when COVID hit, women have suffered a disproportionate employment loss across all regions, and interestingly also across all income groups. The employment loss for women, according to our latest estimates, stands at 5% in 2020, compared to 3.9% for men. Of course, in absolute numbers, men lost more jobs, but that's because women are already lower represented in the labor force. The employment loss of women is also higher in sectors which were particularly hit by the pandemic. That's of course also very clear, such as accommodation and food services, retail, business and administration activities, manufacturing. In all of those sectors, you see really women squeezed out of the labor force. Now, a second point, which is very much related to what I said first, is the reason why many women are penalized in terms of their labor market participation is because they are still carrying the burden of domestic and caregiving responsibilities. We have estimated that before the COVID-19 pandemic, 16.4 billion hours were spent in unpaid care work every day across the world. Over 2/3 of those hours are carried by women. And with the closure of schools and childcare facilities, women had to step up to a much greater extent. So again, women are then squeezed out of the labor market, not because they lose their employment, but because they can't cope with the double burden. And let me give you an example from the United States, where we've seen that 4 times as many women than men dropped out of the labor force in September 2020. So 1 in 4 women who lost their job during the pandemic said it was due to the lack of childcare. And that was a much higher rate than the responses given by men. Now, the third area where we see a disproportionate impact of the crisis on women is in relation to working conditions. We have seen, and I think we've all depended actually on the services of women working in the essential services such as healthcare, maintenance, communication utilities, emergency services. And in the vast majority of countries, women are the backbone in those service sectors. And during the current pandemic, what we have seen are working conditions deteriorating, in particular of healthcare workers, those who are dealing with COVID-19 patients. They have experienced extremely long working hours, insufficient personal protection equipment. Many hospitals are understaffed and resource constrained. And then finally, and this relates also to the point that you've made, Dana, we see, we do take note of reports from many countries where we see a connection between increased violence and lockdowns. And of course, that's also related to the teleworking arrangements. In itself, of course, teleworking can provide great flexibility, but with the financial pressure, with the childcare burden, the anxiety about the future, with the disconnection from support networks, we see that women in particular have become more vulnerable to domestic violence. So those are the 4 areas I would like to mention in terms of the impact of the crisis. And Clayton, if you'll allow me, I would just want to give a few examples of what could be done to address that trend, to reverse that trend. Is that okay?
Please.
Yeah. All right. So let me start with the ILO's normative framework. And it's a pleasure really to say this also here in this audience, because as lawyers, I think you understand and you appreciate the importance of good, sound legal frameworks grounded in international law. We already heard the importance of the Palermo Protocol, but at the international level, you also have the ILO's conventions dealing with the discrimination, with any discrimination in the world of work. And we know, of course, that discrimination is often exacerbated when you look at, or accumulated when you look at gender, the intersection of gender, race, and other factors. And then I would like to highlight also the most recently adopted ILO Convention 190 on addressing harassment and violence in the world of work. I think this is an important instrument that sets clear standards for employers to implement at the workplace, but also for governments to implement through national law. And we call on all countries to quickly ratify this convention. Now, let me come to some practical suggestions where I think we can make a dent, we can really shift the current trend. The first is there needs to be an active promotion of women's participation in managerial and leadership positions. Globally, only 27% of managers and leaders are women. And this is a figure that has changed very little over the last 30 years. So we need more concerted action to get women into leadership positions. We need very strong investments in the care economy. And those investments are not just good for women, they're also good for the economy because they actually create jobs. In the ILO, we have carried out a macroeconomic simulation, and we've estimated that the job creation potential in the care economy could really yield up to 120 million more jobs in 2030 compared to 2015. And indirectly, it would create an additional 149 million jobs. So it's really an important area for public investment. And it's also important because it would help countries to reach the SDGs. Then, of course, coming back to the issue of working conditions, for us, we do advocate for better working conditions for healthcare and other essential workers. We have seen how the emergency has shed light on the importance of removing so-called care pay penalties. Those are gaps in the hourly wages of care workers, and they are experiencing those gaps despite adequate skills levels, experiences, and credentials. We also call for better access to affordable care services for children, for older persons, for the sick, and for disabled persons. And this is very much related also to the extension of social protection floors. We also think that more inclusive leave policies, including paid sick leave, maternity, paternity, and parental leave, would go a long way in helping women, increasing women's participation in the labor force. And here we have seen some good practices during the pandemic where countries have actually broadened, although only on a temporary basis, the circumstances under which paid parental leave is granted. And we know that if women who benefit from this leave are able to retain the job, but we also want more men to take such leave. And then we also want more family-friendly working arrangements generally. So that does include telework, flexible start and finish times, time banking, and the ability to work condensed weeks. However, here I think a lot of work is still needed to actually look at the blurring of lines between the private and the work life. I'm not going into this now, but I think that we also see the mental health impact of this sort of blurring of lines between private and work life. And then finally, in line with the Convention on Violence and Harassment at Work, which I mentioned already, it's really important to create workplaces where violence and harassment are not tolerated. So to conclude, Clayton, it's very important to put women really at the center of the recovery efforts to build back better from COVID-19. And they also need to have a seat at the table where these economic and legal and political decisions are taken that affect them, but that also affect our entire societies. Over to you.
Thank you, Beata, and I'm glad that we are getting to address some of the solutions and responses to these inequalities that exist in our societies. Ambassador Rugwabiza, thank you also for being here today. And as you know, this past year was really supposed to be a momentous year for women, considering it was the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Platform of Action. Can you briefly describe how the pandemic has resulted in a rollback in the gains that have been made for gender equality. And I'd also be interested in hearing a little bit more broadly about how the pandemic has impacted women and girls from not just an economic perspective, but also from a social perspective. So I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Clayton. And let me just greet virtually the co-panelist here, Taina Bien-Aimé. Very pleased to meet you. I know very well Beate from ILO. Good to be with you on this panel. And I would like to, first of all, thank the New York City Bar Association for inviting Rwanda, inviting myself to be part of this conversation with such knowledgeable panelists. And would like to thank very much President Boston, Sheila Boston, for just your opening remarks. They are inspiring, but really we need optimism more than ever right now. I think we all had the sobering statistics that have been shared by both Taina and Beat. Well, I will really not dwell into that because I agree with those statistics. That's the reality. That's the reality. We were not in a position of gender parity, of gender equity, but we lost the ground. We also lost the ground of what had been achieved. We were expecting last year of Beijing Plus 25 to be really a mega year for women empowerment and for gender equality. And that was not the case. It is not only on Beijing Plus 25 and all the priorities of Beijing Plus 25 that we actually saw a regression, but also last year was the 20th anniversary of Resolution 1325 of the Security Council, which is really there's a critical resolution on gender-based violence in conflict. That was marking 20 years. Well, we also saw clear regression there. So I won't dwell too much on the statistics because they were just, and with very specific examples, brilliantly presented by the two previous speakers. Let me just mention just only one that I find also striking, shared by, coming from a report and a report of UN Women, which, as everybody knows, is the UN program and agency for women empowerment and gender equality. Well, that statistic very much confirms all what has been said, that 2/3 of the jobs that have been lost during the pandemic were female. And 2/3 of the students not returning to school are girls during the pandemic, just measuring during that year of the pandemic. 2/3 of the students not returning to school are girls and women. So it is the impact then, when you look at the impact of both, it tells the impact on the economy. They lost their jobs, but it also tells the impact even on the social fabric of the families, and it tells the impact on the future, on the prospects for girls and young women. So it's I will stop there for in terms of really the statistics, because all other statistics were really very elaborate with very specific examples. I would like just to take a little bit more of my time to focus on what could be the solutions, some of the solutions, and basing on what I know best, which is my own country. I think first of all, we have, all of us, we grew We grew up in a world of gender inequities, discrimination against women of all forms and levels. And I believe that one of the problems that ourselves we have to cope with is that we grew up in such a world and we learned to cope with it. Instead of mobilizing, learning to actually find ways, the most effective ways of fighting it. So we don't have a large critical mass of fighting back. We don't have a large critical mass of those who are in positions of power, because gender inequality is essentially a question of power. I agree with the UN Secretary General on that. We operate in a male-dominated world, and that is maintained so through all layers of power. So I think we don't have enough people, and when we are in such a situation with not enough people in position of authority, or those in position of authority not actually using their authority to correct those disparities, then we really need to work hard on building coalitions. And really building coalitions. I see here on this panel, yes, there is the New York City Bar Association. I see Taina today was focusing on municipalities and at city level. Myself representing a country, so at national level, Beata representing a global level, a global organization. In a way, we represent different levels, which if we were really to build strong coalitions together, I believe we can make inroads. We can change a few things. So coalition, not coalition, but also representation. Then representation, in terms of representation, I'm sure many of you know that Rwanda, we're the world leader in terms of representation of female representation in parliament, with more than 61% of our parliamentarians are female. More than 53% of our cabinet members are female. We have exact equality in the judiciary. At local level, at municipalities level, we have not achieved equality yet. We are getting toward 37%. Now, this didn't happen just by chance. So again, political strategy about those women that we have managed to get in those positions. We are seeing the difference in terms of the legislations that are being passed, and we are seeing a difference in terms of the policies. Policies that are pro-family, legislations that are pro-equity. I can tell you, for example, that law on surrogacy would not have passed in our parliament. In our parliament, it will not have passed, simply because with 61% of women, they would have challenged that. So I think representation matters. It matters not only for the numbers, it matters for the legislations that are going to be passed, for the policies that are going to be put in place. And representation, again, here we have our responsibility. How do we get to the representation, to that representation? Well, how did we get also to the 61%? It started, first of all, with a quota. I know quota have their pro and cons. It started with a quota of 30% in our constitution, which is still there, demanding a minimum of 30%. But as you can see, we went way beyond the 30% because we created the incentives for all political parties. They knew that women were not going to vote for them if on their list they didn't put up there in good position female candidates. So it is a challenge also to ourselves. We have a majority of women voters, but it's not reflected in the vote. There have to be a contract there that clearly, how is those who are seeking office, there have to be a clear contract. How are they going to use their office, but also what is it that we are demanding in terms of specific changes in legislations? So that's, I will end there on the question of representation or on that example. A third point I would like to make it is the resources. Unless we put resources and money to really achieve more gender equity, it will simply not work. We need to have gendered budgeting. We needed to have really gendered budgeting, have the budget supporting clearly more integration of women. And when budgets are gendered, then it becomes people go the extra mile. It is sometimes too simple to just accept that, well, look, we will look at the gender element, provided the merit element is there. Well, if actually you have the resources to go and look further, then you will find the merit there. Nobody is asking to favor women, to put, there is no substitute. It's not a trade-off between more representation and capabilities and competencies. My last point and the fourth point I would like to make, it has to do with accountability. And just to mention on the budget, on the budget in Rwanda, the way we did it is that no sectoral budget, no ministry budget can be approved unless by parliament. And again, that was achieved through what I told you before about the representation in parliament. It won't be approved and pass the test of parliament if it is not clearly demonstrated how the sector, the specific sector, and what are the resources allocated to women empowerment and gender equality. So on the element of accountability, we put in place a completely independent structure that is the Gender Monitoring Office. It is a completely independent structure that will check on all that. Is that happening? And will report regularly. It has full authority, it will report. It doesn't depend on the ministry, it doesn't depend on the prime minister. It will report regularly. This is how we are faring, this is happening, or this is not happening. So I'm not saying that we are without challenges. Clearly, we do have challenges. If only what I mentioned due to COVID, we saw ourselves, we know that more than 80% of our frontline workers in the health sector are women. So they were much more exposed to the pandemic than men. And then overnight, as for all of us, we saw that our world moved from in-person attendance, in-person work to a virtual work. So there also, all those who didn't have access to internet, they were just further excluded. And again, we just find out that, well, where we have the largest skills gap, it is a skills gap in terms of digital literacy. It is with women and girls. So we do have challenges that we're trying to attend to, but just to say, please, let's use this shock that is there to build differently, to build back better. Let's at least learn from all the pain and all the suffering, all the loss, that the reason why it has been so, it is due to the inequities. It is certainly not the lack of resources in certain countries. One has to question, how is it that the largest economy in the world, we lose so many people when countries, low-income countries, will find ways of using their resources in a more astute way. So I will end up here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And those statistics are certainly encouraging and give us reason for optimism, especially with regard to the representation statistics that you described. If I could follow up with you just briefly with regard to Rwanda, and I was wondering if you could describe how Rwanda has taken a gender-sensitive economic approach to the recovery, and a little bit more description on how what role women play in the overall recovery for societies from this pandemic.
Well, thank you, Clayton. And you know, in terms of the recovery, and again, it's not specific to Rwanda, but the majority of those who are operating in the informal sector are women. So in terms of the recovery, we did target that specific group of those operating in the informal sector in making sure that well, financial support will go to that specific group. First of all, during the period of lockdown, financial support was directed to those operating in the informal sector. But now that we are in the phase of the recovery, we are also targeting specifically women-held small enterprises, all small enterprises, but specifically women-held small enterprises. We know that they have to attend to almost everything by the mere fact of being women. They have to attend to just bringing food on the table, but at the same time making sure that the family is trying to cope as much as possible. So in the financial incentives, there is a specific targeting here. That's how we are doing it in Rwanda. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Taina, I wanted to turn back to you, and we received a question from someone in the audience, specifically with regard to the commercial surrogacy issue, and they point out that some of the intent behind the New York law was likely to help those from the LGBT community who are using commercial surrogacy in order to have children. And they're asking whether there's other alternatives that your organization would propose to address the issue.
Oh, thank you for that question. It's chock full of information, so I'll be brief. So the first thing is that until February 15th of this year, altruistic surrogacy was allowed in New York. So what we had proposed was to then start maybe a registry for altruistic surrogacy, just as New York has for organ donation. In terms of how this law came about, it was a lot of misinformation and disinformation. For instance, saying that New York was one of the last states to legalize reproductive commercial surrogacy, which is not true. Now New York is only the 10th state with the District of Columbia to have done so. That this was really an extension of the Marriage Equality Act. That is not true, since there is no requirement to be married under the commercial surrogacy law. Although human beings have a right to have a family, there is no fundamental human right to have a biological family, particularly when you look at whose rights you are trampling. So, you know, I'm listening to the ambassador's amazing tally of all these percentages of female participation at all levels of government. And Rwanda has been a model that many countries should aspire to for the last 20 years. Like certainly women's rights activists look at Rwanda and just bow to the amazing achievements that they have done at the level of gender equality within the structures of the state. But in this country, representation does not mean equality for women, unfortunately. And we also have to look at sort of the socio-cultural ideology of country. Every country has their own psyche, right? Their national psyche, their philosophical, cultural identities. Unfortunately, in our country, money speaks. And so when you look at the framework of surrogacy, like the business framework of surrogacy, you've got the contracting parents that need at least $100,000 in disposable income because there are two women involved. You have the egg donor, and then you have the surrogate mother. A surrogate mother receives anywhere between $16,000 and $45,000 for a very, very high risk pregnancy, carrying an embryo that is not hers. So here we are in the middle of COVID-19, understanding what our bodies do in terms of immunity and what we accept and what our body rejects. But yet the person is a reproductive vessel. Now, in terms of, and again, we try to look at solutions, but what's often frustrating is when we regress, right? So most of European countries have banned commercial surrogacy because it is the ultimate commodification of women's bodies for profit of an industry. And this is where reproductive trafficking comes in. China, Nepal, India have also banned it because of the number of deaths and number of really serious illnesses that surrogate mothers have. So for New York to just have this Hallmark card view of surrogacy, especially now when we look at the extreme vulnerabilities of women who have lost. I mean, Beata's presentation says it all. We are facing acute economic vulnerabilities in addition to socio-psychological vulnerabilities of women. So you can imagine, based on the stereotypical view of women, we're as the ambassador said, we all grew up in societies that don't value women as much. I mean, we're all raised in patriarchal societies. And so with that is this sense, like of all the surrogate survivors I've spoken to, when you ask them why did they do it, first it was the need for money, but they also said, I wanted to help someone who was infertile or someone who wanted to start a family, but never did I know that I could have died from it. And so again, it's not a question of whether or not an individual wants a certain thing, it's the role of the state in not creating situations that could lead to severe exploitation, including reproductive trafficking. And there's also one final point is, because we have to always talk about race, especially in this country, is that a surrogate mother can carry cross-racial embryos. And so we know surrogate survivors who are African-American carrying white babies. So that added component to the increased vulnerability and risk of exploitation of women of color is really significant in our great state of New York now.
Thanks for that. Beata, I wanted to turn back to you, and as have been discussing solutions to the pandemic and the impact it's had on women. I'm wondering if you could point to any kind of best examples or best practices that governments have implemented to lessen the impact on women, and also just more generally, I'd be interested to hear what the ILO or the UN as well has been doing on this front.
Well, thank you, Clayton, for this question. I mean, first of all, it's been truly inspiring to listen to the other panelists, and there's so much to say on Ambassador what you said in terms of representation, gender sensitive budgeting, absolutely right spot on here. I think that's where we have to go. It's participation, voice, and it's money and accountability. But to your question, Clayton, I mean, one area where the ILO has been very active in recent years is to address the gender pay gap. I mean, I want to drill down a little bit on the economics here. The gender pay gap is still at an estimated 20%. So in other words, women earn 20% less for the same job of equal value than men. And we need to better understand why this is, because that creates the vulnerability in financial terms, right? So we have launched, together with UN Women and the OECD, a global coalition, the Equal Pay International Coalition, which brings together governments, but also importantly, the private sector to help companies also to better understand the gender pay gap and close it. And we've seen progress here in this area, and we hope, of course, that COVID will not reverse that positive trend. Then another area is, as I mentioned, I mean, with the Convention 190 on violence and harassment in the world of work being adopted in 2019, we actively promote ratification. We have now enough ratifications so that it will enter into force in June this year. And this will be a date we will all celebrate, I hope. But we need more countries, of course, to come on board. And ratification, of course, means transposing international standards on eliminating violence in the world of work into national law. And it also means, from an ILO perspective, that workers and employers organizations have a very, very important role to play in implementing those laws in practical terms. And I think the process itself, which took, leading to the adoption of the convention, which took place right at the heart of the Me Too movement, has led to tremendous awareness raising and sensibilization. And I think that's what we need to continue doing, really running a campaign to take this issue really to the workplace, in particular to workplaces where women are predominated. So I leave it at this point. I also saw a very interesting question on bias in the chat box, but I let you go on with the discussion, Clayton, but I'd be happy to come back.
Well, unfortunately, we only have a few more minutes before this panel concludes, but I'm very interested in this the concept of coalition building, and I agree very much with the points that have been made in that regard. And I'd open the floor to any of the panelists who'd like to respond, but I was wondering if you guys had any kind of words of advice on how we can build these coalitions, whether it be between local, state, and federal governments or private public partnerships. Any kind of lessons from your guys' experience on how best to go about this?
Well, thank you for the question. I mean, the essence of my work is building coalitions for a particular purpose. And again, I think coalition building is very, very difficult. But you always have to start with the grassroots, right? Because you find solutions where the problems occur. And I think there's no better example than Rwanda, for instance, where after the horrors of 1994, that they were able to build from the ground up and reach the statistics that the ambassador just mentioned, is about coalition building and really going from the ground up. Now, having said that, obviously, once you do build coalitions, whether they're local, national, or international coalitions, you have to invite the policymakers and the decision makers. And so that's why civil society participation is so important within the UN systems, the regional body systems, the treaty body systems. And it's long and it's hard and it can take a decade, but if you're focused, obviously that is the essence of a coalition, like you have to have one common ground. We have seen mountains moved, and so I strongly recommend coalition building. Thank you.
Should I probably go next, or Ambassador, would you like to? I leave you the final.
Go ahead, Beata.
Yeah, I mean, Taina, what you said really resonates with us as well. I mean, it was ILO also leading some of the coalitions, and actually a lot of it is leading from behind, because coalition building really means giving enough space to everyone to be able to contribute and to also get recognition. That's actually really part of the lessons learned. But another really important insight from our experience with coalition building, such as the one I mentioned on equal pay, is the importance of accountability and focus on concrete action. You can spend a lot of time in wonderful meetings, you know, trying to build coalitions, but in the end of the day, something needs to get done, and coalitions need to be measured by what they actually achieve. And here, I think it's important to, from the start, to set clear benchmarks of what we want to achieve. And in this case, we want to have equal pay for work of equal value, whether it's men, women, or whoever carries out this work. Thank you.
Ambassador Rugobiza, I'll give you the final word. Unfortunately, I know we could go on for quite a bit longer, but I'd give you the last word, and then we'll take a short break.
Thank you very much, Clayton, and thank you really to my co-panelists, because quite honestly, they said it all. They say what I wanted to say in terms of coalition. Anything additional would be really just to reemphasize the need for a focus on a specific target. That's what Taina has been doing. That's what Beata has been doing, and Taina is focusing on one specific sector of violence, of gender-based violence. Now, an element that we cannot continue to just tolerate it. It's really gender-based violence, both in times of conflict and in times of peace. Women continue to be the target of violence. So that means whatever we are doing, it's not working. So can we have a coalition on just bringing all of us together and say, well, what we have been doing for these years is not working, and we need to change this situation. This resolution 1325, we are not seeing enough progress, and we have used few avenues, but I know that at global level, it's very difficult to bring people to a point where they say, this is not working, or this is not working fast enough, or this is not transforming the situation as we wish to see it transformed. So again, I will rely on this. I know the next panel will focus very much on that. And the New York City Bar Association, hopefully you can continue to be this great connector that you have been for us here. And coalition needs connections. Thank you.
Ambassador, I think that's a perfect place for us to end, and a great transition to our next panel. I know on behalf of the City Bar and the United Nations Committee, we would like to thank all of our excellent panelists for this panel. It was truly an inspiring conversation for myself. So thank you. I invite you all to stick around for the next panel, as well as the fireside chat. We're going to take around a 5-minute break before our next panel. So feel free to mute your microphones and turn off your video and relax for a few minutes.
Thank you, Clayton. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Clayton.
Thank you.
I can't hear you.
Hi, yes, I was on mute. Hi, Akila, how are you? Hi, Dubravka.
Hello.
Hi, good to see you.
Hello, Camila.
I'm so sorry I will not be able to stay with you. I wish I'm doing like back-to-back meetings. Like it's so hard to turn invitations down on the 8th of March. And like you sent me the invitation in January. So I was like trying to see, okay, let's do a first come, first serve. But it's hard to turn down, but I know you'll understand.
Yes.
How are you, Dubravka? Are you in New York?
I'm in New York, yes.
Hey, we have to catch up. It's getting better now.
If you
Right?
have time for coffee, we can go out for a coffee.
Yes, let's do that, okay? You have my
Okay.
phone number. You have my phone number.
I don't know, but do you have mine or email or?
Yeah, I'll send you an email. Let's
Okay,
catch up.
good.
I'm a bit nervous. This is my first time. You all are professional, panelists, so bear with me. Yeah, but I'm excited. I'm so glad you ladies could join us, and yeah.
Hi, could I get a quick sound check from Akila, please? Nope, your microphone's off. I see you're now muted, but I don't hear your microphone.
How about now?
Perfect.
Okay, great.
Should we mute us or not? Should we be muted?
Stay muted until it's your time to speak.
Okay.
Ms. Simonovic, I just wanted to thank you for your call for submissions on rape. We submitted something.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, so thank you so much.
It will come out in June, so very soon.
We're looking forward to it. Thank you very much. Hi, Pramila. Nice to see you again.
Hello, USG Pramila. It's so good to see you.
Good to see you too. How are you?
Very well, thank you.
I mean, last year it was the last event I actually participated, with Akila. It was it was the last one. Little did we know what was awaiting us.
I know.
Yeah.
Our office shut down the very next day, so it really was the very last public thing, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it was the last public engagement, and then 13th of March, and that was it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wild.
Welcome and good afternoon. My name is Shania Senvalis, and I will be the moderator for this panel. This afternoon, our esteemed guests will discuss the topic of eliminating violence against women in order to allow for women's full and effective participation and decision-making in public life. Our panelists, thought leaders, and experts in their fields are the Honorable Pramila Patten, the United Nations Special Representative on Sexual Violence and Conflict, Dr. Dubravka Simonovic, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, and Ms. Akila Radhakrishnan, President of the Global Justice Center. After delivering their 10 to 15 remarks, each panelist will answer questions curated by myself and the audience, with the exception of Undersecretary General Pramila Patten, who due to her demanding schedule will not be able to stay after her remarks to accept questions. Just a bit of housekeeping. Each panelist has been allotted 15 minutes for their remarks. I want to be respectful of everyone's time so that at the 1 minute mark as a moderator, I will politely remind panelists to quickly wrap up before moving on to the next speaker. During the question and answer portion of the panel, I would like to keep the answers to 3 minutes. Welcome all. Now we're going to begin the first question to all the panelists, beginning with Undersecretary General Patton. In the past year, COVID-19 has had devastating effects, especially on already vulnerable communities, especially women in those communities. By the same token, however, we have gained the first woman vice president of color in the United States, and there are more female world leaders now than ever. Could you please frame the issue regarding the status of women in the world, historically and now, and please share your background and work in this area?
Thank you, Tanya. Distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, I would really like to start by expressing my sincere gratitude to the organizers for the invitation to this second International Law Conference, and also to commend the focus of our discussion today, which indeed is very timely, especially in light of the wake-up call triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic. I also thank you for the interest in my mandate and for giving me an opportunity to share with you some highlights of the annual report of the Secretary General on conflict-related sexual violence, which will actually be debated before the Security Council next month. And sharing this year's report with you, which covers the period from January to December 2020, is also topical because it actually examines the challenges stemming from the intersecting crisis of conflict, displacement, and COVID-19. It underlines the risk of hard-won gains and political commitments being rolled back or reversed due to the pandemic. And at the same time, it really highlights the agency and resilience of survivors themselves. Of course, in addition to the innovations adopted by service providers, including civil society organizations, despite restricted mobility and access constraints. And this year's report speaks volume about the importance of women's full and effective participation in public and political life. You will be surprised that despite COVID-19 related constraints to reporting by survivors and monitoring by UN agencies, the report still documents over 2,500 UN verified cases of conflict-related sexual violence committed in the course of 2020 alone. And I can assure you that this is only the tip of the iceberg. Again, with the vast majority of incidents targeting women and girls, and the highest number recorded in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Some of the key themes featured in this year's report include the impact of COVID-19 in exacerbating underreporting and trends of increasing militarization, which have given rise to new protection concerns, such as sexual violence against women detained for alleged violations of curfews and quarantine. The report makes a very strong case for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence not to be forgotten in national response and recovery plans, and for including the participation of survivors who have suffered the effects of these interlocking crises. And this is critical as part of building back better. The report notes that the impact of the pandemic is actually compounded by intersecting forms of discrimination. We've already marginalized survivors of sexual violence at risk of being left further behind. As a structural root cause, we see how intersecting inequality places, for example, LGBTQI individuals, indigenous women, refugees and migrants, and persons living with disabilities at elevated risk, underscoring that survivors cannot be treated as a homogeneous group. Likewise, we'll see how multiple and intersecting stigma following the wake of sexual violence with potentially lethal repercussions, including the stigma arising from forced association with violent extremist groups. And we've noted this trend in Iraq, Syria, Nigeria, Somalia, and Mali. The report also draws attention to the trend of entrenched localized conflict that give rise to patterns of sexual violence with intercommunal tensions perpetuating cycles of sexual violence. And again, disturbing patterns were observed of armed actors and community-based militia employing various forms of sexual violence, including sexual slavery, as part of cycles of identity or resource-based conflict in the DRC, Somalia, and South Sudan. As a general trend, we find that CRSV does not occur in a vacuum, but is tied to broader security dynamics, such as the resurgence of hostilities, the rise of violent extremism, the proliferation of small arms and light weapons, mass population displacement, and collapsed rule of law. And these factors trigger renewed patterns of CRSV, which are generally concentrated in context of abduction and captivity, displacement, detention, and in remote rural areas where women undertake essential livelihood activities. The importance of demilitarization, for example, and effective arms control as a contribution to overall prevention is reflected in a specific recommendation, as is the call for a global ceasefire in order to address the pandemic. The one aspect of the report on which I would particularly like to focus on, given the theme of today's conference, relates to the global political climate of shrinking civic space and pushback on women's rights, the abiding challenge of ensuring women's meaningful participation at all levels of peace processes, as well as the disturbing trend of misogynistic attacks on women's human rights defenders and reprisals against women who are vocal and visible on these issues. And I cannot stress enough how in conflict-affected countries, women's organizations and networks are a lifeline for their communities and at-risk groups, especially as sexual violence continues to be used as a cruel tactic of war, torture, terror, and political repression while the pandemic rages on. In 2020, for example, we've seen many instances of how women were specifically targeted for their activism. In Burundi, women from opposition parties faced targeted intimidation, threats, and arbitrary detention during the electoral period. In the Central African Republic, pre-electoral violence flared up, exposing women and girls to threats and heightened risk of sexual violence. In the wake of religious extremism, women are increasingly being directly targeted by extremist movements in both subtle and overt ways, with extremist forces exerting considerable pressure to restrict their legal rights and circumscribe their participation in public and political life. In this global political climate of shrinking civic space and pushback on women's rights, women who are in the public eye as they challenge established norms are prominent targets. Women leaders representing neglected constituencies, such as ethnic and sexual minorities, displaced persons or refugees, to name but a few, are also preyed upon. Women human rights defenders have been facing increased repression and violence. The targeting of women in public life through sexual violence, harassment, and threats, as observed in Afghanistan, Colombia, Libya, Yemen, and elsewhere, really serve to silence, humiliate, discredit, and punish them, demonstrating the inextricable link between protection and participation. You will all recall the killing of Maritza, a 60-year-old Colombian land rights activist, in January 2019, or that of Fatima in June 2019, a 24-year-old outspoken advocate for women's rights from Afghanistan, sent shockwaves, and were also a stark reminder that speaking out on social and political issues, whether land disputes or women's rights, is dangerous business. In Colombia alone, the Ombudsman's office reported 480 threats against women leaders and women human rights defenders in 2019, including misogynistic insults and threat of sexual violence. The United Nations verified 102 women human rights defenders, journalists, and trade unionists as having been killed in 26 conflict-affected countries between 2015 to 2019. And this figure, I can assure you, only represents the tip of the iceberg. But at the same time, we all know that 25 years ago, the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action set the international target of gender balance in decision-making. Despite some gains in women's formal political participation, women are underrepresented at all levels of decision-making in all regions of the world. In fact, progress has stalled in many regions and even regressed in some places. And these trends and patterns have only deepened over the past year, intersecting with an unprecedented crisis, a public health crisis, which has fast become an economic and social crisis, and a protection and human rights crisis rolled into one. With COVID-19, the context for women's participation and leadership in public life is shifting further. One of the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic on my mandate relates to its profound implications for international peace and security, with the further marginalization of women in political decision-making, in particular where peace agreements are being negotiated or in countries undergoing political transitions. And the Security Council, when it endorsed the global ceasefire in its resolution 2532 of 2020, further recognized the risk that fragile peace processes could be derailed in the wake of the pandemic. Protecting women's space in politics is especially important in the conflict resolution area. Despite women's long-standing role in informal dispute resolution, their near absence from peace talks and similar international security processes and mechanisms, as in Yemen or Afghanistan, requires particular attention. And we have to recall that inherent in Security Council Resolution 2122 is a clear message that peace and development will be compromised if the voices of women are not heard and if their participation in all phases of conflict prevention, conflict resolution, and peace building is not ensured. Support for the inclusion of women is more important now than ever before. Women's rights organizations are the most affected by the enactment of laws that shrink civic space. Aside from the scrutiny and restrictions in some countries brought about by counter-terrorism laws, various other restrictions on NGOs are being used by the authorities to target civil society actors that advocate on behalf of women and girls in their community. Central to the advancement and protection of women's human rights in the immediate aftermath of conflict and in the long-term post-conflict setting is women's ability to effectively and meaningfully participate in the public and political life of their country. We know that the immediate aftermath of conflict provides a very strategic opportunity for states parties to adopt legislative and policy measures to eliminate discrimination against women in the public and political life of the country, and to ensure that women have equal opportunities to participate in the formal structures of the new government by ensuring women's political participation. Yet, women are marginalized in post-conflict and peace-building processes, with their ability to effectively and meaningfully participate in the public and political life of their country being very limited. Protecting women in public life is a global political issue that affects us all. What is clear is that the stresses of the virus must not be used to excuse or further legitimize violence against women and girls or exclude women and girls from public life. The challenges women face in participating in public and political life are multifaceted. Social and cultural norms hold them back from political participation, but more importantly, acts and threats of violence serve as both cause and consequence of women's limited participation in public life. Women are targeted with violence aimed precisely at discouraging and removing them from public life. Sexual and other forms of violence against women remains a pervasive violation of human rights. For women to participate fully in public life, political institutions must be free of gender-based discrimination and violence. All violence must be recognized as such and denounced and met with sanctions to prevent normalization and escalation, because such violence not only affects women engaged in formal politics, but also women across public life, including women activists, journalists, and human rights defenders. There is a real sense of urgency for various stakeholders to take actions to redress gender imbalances in leadership. World leaders must speak out more forcefully about the critical importance of women's participation in public and political life. It is no longer enough for member states to hear the call for women's leadership. It is time for them to reassert the centrality of women's participation and decision-making in public life to achieve sustainable development and to respond fully. After all, member states bear the duty to prevent, investigate, and punish acts of violence against women, and to act by institutionalizing an approach of zero tolerance of intimidation, sexual harassment, and any other form of sexual and gender-based violence, adopting relevant legislation and policies, and making the requisite resources available to promote and enable the full and meaningful participation of women in political and public spheres. The participation of women is non-negotiable. More men must step up and do their part to break the cycle of exclusion. In this context of shrinking physical, civic, and political spaces, efforts to create new pathways for the meaningful participation of women is needed. A multi-track approach that increases the number of women, integrates a gender equality perspective, and is grounded in discussions with feminist and women's rights constituencies, including human rights defenders and peace builders, is critical.
Undersecretary General, 1 minute.
Yes. The primary cause of the lack of progress is the absence of political will to fully realize the global commitments. Increased commitments, reinforced policies, and accountability frameworks from member states are critical if we are serious about reversing the trend. This is not time to neglect human rights, and member states must honor their obligations under CEDAW, for example. To conclude, I would like to add that crisis can also bring about new norms for leadership, and COVID-19 pandemic presents such an opportunity. The lessons from this human crisis can precisely lead to more peaceful, just, inclusive, and resilient societies, and deliver on the promise of the 2030 agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Undersecretary General Patton, for those insightful remarks and for joining us today. Dr. Simonovic, I pose the same question to you.
Thank you. Let me start by greeting all and wishing you happy International Women's Day. I would like to thank New York City Bar Association for inviting me to participate with my fellow panelists at this important panel. As United Nations Special Rapporteur on violence against women, its causes and consequences, I would like to start with short explanation of this mandate, because it is different mandate than others. It is an independent expert mandate, so I am not paid by the UN. I am not part of the system, but I'm appointed by Human Rights Council for a period of 3 and after that another 3 years. So I have started as a special rapporteur in 2015, and my term is going to finish in July this year, 6 years. So, but this post was established in 1994, many, many years ago, to send a clear message that violence against women is a human rights violation, and there is a state responsibility to prevent violence against women, to provide services, and to prosecute perpetrators. So this mandate is entrusted to recommend measures at a national, regional, and international level on elimination of violence against women, its causes and consequences, focusing on state responsibilities to eliminate such violence, including due diligence responsibility with respect to acts by private persons. During past 6 years, I have visited 11 countries and produced country reports, and I have also elaborated 10 thematic reports on violence against women, its causes and consequences, and all those reports reveal gaps between realities of women and girls at the national ground and international commitments accepted by those states. I have also elaborated a number of thematic reports, but just let me mention maybe countries that I have visited. I have visited Bulgaria and Ecuador, Canada and Nepal, Australia and Bahamas, Argentina, State of Palestine, Occupied Palestinian territories, Israel, Georgia, and South Africa. So in all those countries, I have seen this huge gap. I have seen how far away realities and human rights violation are widespread with respect to gender-based violence against women and girls. Then I have focused on thematic reports because I am invited to produce thematic report to Human Rights Council, but also United Nations General Assembly. And when I started, I have issued a vision setting report, basically focusing on what needs to be done in a future from my perspective. Previously, I was member of the CEDAW committee as Under Secretary General Pamela Patton. So from that perspective, now with new tools under this mandate, with possibilities to visit the countries, I have seen that the focus should be now on implementation. We really need to see implementation and we need to see results. So after that, I have also focused on adequacy of international framework on violence against women. We all know that situation is a little bit complicated if we look at international framework on violence against women, and that violence is treated under Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, CEDAW Convention, regional conventions, and so on. And here we need to see how to really focus on implementation. I have also focused on modalities on establishment of a femicide watch, or observatories on prevention of femicides, or gender-related killings of women. My report was also addressing shelters and protection orders, or holistic approach related to prevention of violence against women by specific services, but also other measures like protection orders that are needed to prevent violence against women. I have also produced a report on violence against women in politics, what is focus of this panel. And in this report, I have really focused on this type of violence that was not addressed up to now, as it is going to be addressed at the session of the CSW, because up to now we were looking at percentage of women in politics and public spaces and how to increase percentage. We were not so much focused on obstacles, why women are not in politics and public places, why we have only 22% of women in parliaments as a world average percentage. So what are main obstacles? And basically, women are discouraged from active political participation due to different forms of gender-based violence, sexual harassment, and other things that are stopping them to be politically active, done by different type of perpetrators, including also fellow or opposition parliamentarians, media representatives, political adversaries. So there are many recommendations in my report on that topic, including recommendations that are addressing also national parliaments, that as such should need complaint mechanisms. I'm also addressing political parties. They also need to address this situation and to adopt internal party regulations, sending message related to zero tolerance to violence against women in politics. Then during the election process, it is also important to focus on elimination of violence against women. Let me briefly mention that I have also done report on 25 years of the mandate, because each 5 years mandate holders are looking back and looking forward what needs to be done in the future, what was achieved. And there are many challenges also for this mandate. It should be strengthened. I have also focused on obstetric violence or violence against women during the childbirth. And we are seeing in many parts of the world that women are silenced with respect to this type of violence. They are not really speaking up, and when they are speaking up, they are not believed. So there is kind of rejection of this type of violence, because in many situations we are seeing sexism, we are seeing lack of informed consent. So in this report, you will see also very important recommendations related to elimination of this type of violence. I have also done a report on violence against women journalists. They are comparable with women in political spaces because they are in the front lines. They are attacked because they are women journalists, and they are facing different types of intersectional discrimination as women coming also from different minority groups. And we are seeing that they are under threat. That is really showing which type of protection is needed. Then I have last year produced report on COVID-19 pandemic and pandemic of gender-based violence against women. And that was addressed in your first panel. But I have called all states to send me inputs and other stakeholders. So I have received 274 inputs from different stakeholders that have really revealed that we have increase of gender-based violence during the COVID-19 pandemic. We do not have good comparable data. And we do have, from countries that do have data, they are showing increase of domestic violence and intimate partner femicides. We have also seen that during this period that was problem with access to reproductive health services in a number of countries because they were not seen as necessary, but they are human rights-based services that should be available during this pandemic. And basically this whole pandemic exposed and exacerbated pre-existing gaps and shortcomings in elimination of violence against women. Because, for example, in some countries, there are no shelters, there are no protection orders. So then what are possibilities for women in such situation? They are at home with perpetrators and they are under risk of domestic violence. So we can also pose a question, what is gender-based violence against women? Where do we have clear definition? And we do have definition in Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, but that one is not legally binding. And we do have definition produced by CEDAW committee in General Recommendation 19. So they are working definitions that are showing that gender-based violence against women is a structural pandemic of ongoing violations of women's human rights based on unequal power relationship between women and men. This discrimination is deeply rooted in discrimination against women in law, in practice, in harmful gender stereotypes, and perceived roles of women in our society. So many times different persons are asking me, so tell us, where is the worst situation? Who are the worst countries? Where is the highest number of violence against women? And here we are seeing really lack of good comparable data. We know that violence is widespread, and we know basic data that it affects 1 in every 3 women worldwide. And I have, for that reason, also focused on femicides or gender-related killings of women and clear collection of data in this category, because all states do collect homicide data. In homicide data, there are two specific categories of intimate partner killings and family-related killings. And if we look at intimate partner killings, this is context of domestic violence. In that type of killings, out of 10 persons killed, more than 8 or 80% are women. And this is coming out from different parts of the world, from different states that are collecting such data. But unfortunately, many states do not have such data. Many states do not have this data that is showing relationship between victim and perpetrator. So I have called all states to establish femicide watches or observatories or national bodies that will collect such data and that will focus on analysis of cases, of femicide cases, and recommend measures for prevention of such cases in the future. I would also like to mention that this is a huge area, violence against women and girls, and there are also new topics. So I have, as a special rapporteur, addressed also online violence against women. There are new forms of online violence against women, like non-consensual distribution of intimate images. Some countries are now having regulations, but at the world level, many states do not have regulation. Then there are also problems with obstetric violence that I have already mentioned, that was not in focus, but it should be in focus. And finally, I would like to mention my next thematic report that is focusing on rape. As a
Dr. Simonovic, one minute left.
Okay, my next report is focusing on rape as a widespread form of human rights violation, as a crime, and as a gender-based violence that is currently really resulting with impunity. Rape is criminalized in many states, but as a result, we are seeing impunity for perpetrators. And basically what is now analyzed in my report is that in many states, national laws and other provisions in criminal law are not in line with international standards. For example, there are a number of countries that are excluding marital rape from criminalization of rape. So in my report, I will list those countries, and I have clear recommendation that they need to change such laws. Also, there are problems with definition of rape in many states. Rape should be defined based on explicit lack of consent. And in many definitions around the world, there is no such, many states do not have explicit inclusion of a lack of consent. And this consent should be given freely and assessed in a context of surrounding circumstances. So it must be clear that sexual intercourse without consent should be criminalized as rape in all definitions in all states. So now we are short with time. I would like to mention that as a special rapporteur on violence against women, I'm focusing on implementation strategies, on results. I'm calling for UN Global Implementation Plan on Violence Against Women. I'm calling UN member states to put violence against women as a standard agenda item before the CSW, to examine violence against women each year, not only from time to time, every 5 years and so on. So I will stop here and I would gladly respond to questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Simonovic. Now, Ms. Radhakrishnan, same question to you.
Thank you so much, Shania. And thank you so much to the New York City Bar for having me today and to my co-panelists. It's a true pleasure to participate on this important panel, and I really can't think of a better way to celebrate International Women's Day, even if we're all kind of stuck at homes in our various apartments and houses. As I think SRS2 Patton was talking about at the beginning during the break, this event was the last event that many of us did in person last year. So it's nice to be drawing it full circle, and it's also nice to see the hope of the sunshine as we potentially, see ourselves moving outside. As Chania mentioned, I'm Akila Radhakrishnan. I'm the president of the Global Justice Center, an international human rights organization dedicated to advancing gender equality through the rule of law. We combine legal analysis with strategic advocacy to ensure equal protection of the law for women and girls. And so, as a starting point, let me just say, I'm not sure there's much more for me to say here after my two brilliant co-panelists have gone. They've laid out this global architecture of on gender-based violence and the important roles that they play as individuals and as a part of an institution to make the vision of a world free from violence a reality. So, I'll just add in a few layers here. And so I think that for me, I was really delighted to see that the panel was focused on the connection between violence against women and women's full, effective, and meaningful participation. Because often when we think of and we treat violence, we treat it in a vacuum. But in fact, there's a direct and symbiotic relationship between such violence and gender inequality. Studies have shown that high rates of gender inequality are correlated with higher instances of violence against women and more broadly, conflict and political instability. And as a result, there's a real need when addressing violence against women to take an approach that builds and works towards gender equality, which is really the only solution to the problem that we're talking about here. We cannot root out violence if we do not also uproot the patriarchal systems that for far too long have allowed violence and inequality to thrive, and in fact, in some ways, rely on violence and inequality to thrive. And so let's make this a little bit more concrete and talk about a country where my organization has worked since 2005, which is in the news and a perfect example of this issue here, Myanmar, which actually Sheila talked about in the beginning of her intro. It's been in the news a lot recently. And so just a quick background on the current situation in Myanmar for those who aren't familiar with it. On February 1st of this year, Myanmar's military staged a coup where overnight they arrested or detained key political figures, including the country's de facto head of state, Aung San Suu Kyi, prevented the formation of a new parliament, which was due to begin that morning, and declared themselves the leaders of the country. Now, the military did this under the guise of contesting the results of Myanmar's elections that were held in November 2020, which they say was rife with fraud and other improprieties that invalidate the election results. Sound familiar to any of us? And so now, for over the past month, the people of Myanmar have taken to the streets in protest and have refused to recognize the military government. These protests have been met with violent repression, and in particular in the last week, with over 50 people dead and over 1,700 people detained or arrested since February 1st. And who's been at the center of this movement? Who's been the face of this movement? It's women. And I think that's really important for us to talk about and focus on here, because the military's forceful takeover of the civilian government and subsequent crackdown on peaceful protesters is a setback for democracy and the rule of law in the country, but it's also particularly devastating for women. And the reason here is that the coup not only threatens to reverse progress made over the past decade to build slowly, and albeit with some problems, towards gender equality in the country to ensure that women in Myanmar have more opportunities, power, and influence in society, but it also places an unaccountable military with a history of perpetrating violence against women and control of every aspect of government. So let's talk a little bit about what this violence looks like. I'm trying to concretize this into a single example here because we often talk about it in these very general terms. And so, in the context of Myanmar, gender-based violence has been a hallmark of the military's operation for decades, with credible reports of sexual assault, rape, and killing of women throughout ethnic areas. This led in 2017, the UN's independent fact-finding mission for Myanmar to find that sexual violence perpetrated by the military was a part of a deliberate, well-planned strategy to intimidate, terrorize, and punish the civilian population. The military has been listed by the United Nations Secretary General through the work that SRSG Patton does as a party credibly suspected of committing or being responsible for patterns of rape and other forms of sexual violence. Now, let's remember now that they were long in control of the country, and now they're back in control of the country. And this is the risks that we're looking at as we assess what's going on in the country today. And in addition to the pervasive sexual violence in its conflict with ethnic groups, there's also a link more directly, both in Myanmar and then around the world, that we've seen between these types of acts and militarization more generally. In Myanmar, examples abound of sexual violence, including against girls as young as 14 in areas where military bases and camps are present. At present, with the military in control of the government, as well as with the massive deployment of security forces all over the country to respond to the ongoing civil disobedience movement, there's no doubt that this total militarization of the country poses serious risks to women. And over the past few weeks, we've actually seen this play out. So in the past few weeks, we've seen the military and police, in fact, target and harass female protesters in targeted ways. In one instance, for example, soldiers and police yelled at a 16-year-old woman, "Come here, bitch," and dragged her by the hair and thrust her into their truck. These are the experiences of what it's like to be women on the front lines of defending democracy. It is, the situation in Myanmar is going right now, and it is dire, but these are experiences that I've heard personally from women who have been involved in these type of movements around the world and around, the decades. These are ubiquitous experiences for politically active women. And so I think this is why we also must think about what are the root causes, right? Because when we think about the violence, in some ways we can't focus on the violence itself because it doesn't lead us to the solutions. So again, let's go back to talking about Myanmar and how you cannot separate the violence from the patriarchal institutions that perpetrate and condone them. So in Myanmar, before this last coup, the military was in control from 1962 to 2011. And women in Myanmar during that time period were excluded from positions of power, did not receive the same educational and economic opportunities as men, and were marginalized in society. And this was paired with a culture of militarization and hypermasculinity, gendered social norms that dictated that women and girls should take charge of the household, family, and other caretaking responsibilities. Women's roles was not in public. Women's roles were not in political decision-making. Men were considered the natural leaders, and women were only suitable for support positions and in need of male protection. This patriarchal mindset has even translated itself into particular provisions of, for example, the military drafted constitution in the country, which actually provides that certain jobs are suitable for men only, and repeatedly refers to women as mothers within the framework of the constitution. And so, to me, it's this mindset that informs why sexual violence and violence against women is a tool that's utilized. And it also then says that confronting the patriarchy must be the way forward for the country. So what really does this mean in the context of Myanmar? It means that gender equality must be at the center of efforts to rebuild the country. It means that these women who've been seen as the face of this resolution, they cannot just be powerful images for us to print on newspaper covers, which is, the Sheila at the beginning of this whole thing, when she did her introduction, she actually read a quote from an activist in a recent article in the New York Times, which had powerful images of women with their hands up protesting in the country. But we also need to make sure that as we move forward, they're given positions of power and roles in the creation and future of the country. And this goes back to the theme of this panel, women's full, effective, and meaningful participation. That is how we're going to build this bridge to gender equality. Women's rights advocates in Myanmar have long been advocating for the changes the country needs to make to achieve gender equality in the country, end to military impunity, a comprehensive violence against women law, which, Dr. Simonovich was just talking about the need to have these frameworks that adequately define rape, and in modern ways, the country lacks that. Reform of the country's abortion law and equal access to reproductive rights, equal access to educational opportunities. But these issues, they haven't been a priority. Progress on gender equality has been slow and limited. So if we know that gender inequality was an enabling factor to the fallback in violence in Myanmar, then it's essential that we make the connection between gender equality and the peace and security of the country. So that really just brings us back full circle here. And I just have two final little thoughts here. I'm not great at the big speeches, but I think two things. One, often when we talk about this, we're faced with chicken and egg conversations here, right? What do you start with? Well, if the violence, oftentimes violence feels like the thing we have to deal with right now. We can get to the equality once we've dealt with the violence, right? But if the solution to violence is equality, then we're really failing ourselves here and thinking with a bigger imagination about how do we approach the scenario. So I think really you have to address them together and go hand in hand. And it is entirely possible for us to be addressing two different issues at the exact same time. So while we may need targeted interventions and responses focused on violence, they need to be integrated with broader efforts to ensure women's equality and build their power, including by ensuring their equal representation in political and decision-making spheres. So let me conclude here with a final thought about why I think it's important to have women in power. And here I leave Myanmar and come back to America. So I think we all remember last year when a fellow member of Congress called Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez a fucking bitch. And it's not the fact of him calling her that stuck out to me. It was her response, because I think as women in these political spaces, we've all had similar experiences. We've experienced what violent rhetoric against our own work looks like, against our own selves looks like. But what was remarkable to me was I remember watching her speak on the floor of the US Congress, refusing to accept Congressman Yoho's flaccid apology and for calling out his violent misogyny for what it was. And to me, that highlighted two things. One, it was a powerful reminder that so many men who are in power are active hindrances to women's rights and equality, because Congressman Yoho doesn't just use rhetoric like this. He also has a track record of supporting legislation on women's rights 0% of the time. And two, it's a reminder of why it's important to then have feminists like AOC in positions of power, because we don't see these topics addressed with that level of force on the floors of Parliament and of Congress. And that in and of itself, to bring that issue forward, to challenge a fellow powerful individual, a fellow powerful male was really important. But it's also, I think, a reminder that as she's doing that, she's also using her space in political life, in public life, to advance key pieces of legislation and initiatives that are inherent to gender equality, working on issues around economic justice, reproductive rights, taking an intersectional approach. And that's what I think about when I think about why it's important to have women in positions of power. We so bring these experiences that have so long been normalized, and we're able to kind of help shift and transform this conversation from one that takes our experiences of violence and existing as women in the society towards one that builds power for everybody and creates a more equal world. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Radhakrishnan. That was very lively, and I love the illustration of a very broad topic. So my first question goes to you. How can women navigate misogynistic and patriarchal societies and customs in order to reach gender parity?
I think it's interesting. I think your choice of the word navigating is interesting, because navigating kind of assumes that we're stuck within the framework that they've built, right? So if the patriarchy and the misogyny are the basis of the systems that we're navigating, then are we actually best served by working fully within these systems? Or are we best, do we best do this by actually, rather than navigating, by tearing down and rebuilding these systems? Because I think that, to me, is actually where we go from here. We need to reject so many of the premises that our halls of power and institutions are built upon, because they are ones of men like Congressman Yoho or others who've built their own reputations and stakes on violence and on the oppression of minorities. And so, to me, I would say let's reframe that question, and let's reframe that question as well about not in a way that we centralize this fight for gender equality as one that means progress towards us all. When we talk about this connection between equality and peace, right? There's actually been studies that show that more gender equal societies are less susceptible to falling into conflict, are less, when conflicts do occur, they actually are shorter and of less intensity. And so let's reframe this conversation. It's not just about giving women some rights so that we can kind of coexist in this world. It's also about building a more peaceful and stable world that works for everybody. And the only other thing I'll add here is, and I know there was a whole panel dedicated to COVID right before this, but when you think about how quickly women's rights were rolled back during COVID, when we talk about the immense losses, the number of women who've left the economy, it means that what we were building, even as we were building it, was so fragile that something like a pandemic can roll us back that quickly? How do we roll back in a matter of, you know, a year what we thought was work that we've been building on for decades? And that's why I think it's even more important to reframe this conversation so that what we build is a stronger base, and one that's not built on the foundations of patriarchy and misogyny, but one that's built on the foundations of equality itself.
Thank you, Ms. Radhakrishnan. Dr. Simonovic, the next question is for you. You mentioned in your remarks that this is a broad topic and it's being monitored, but not well enough. What else can be done to monitor the state of women and gender-based crimes?
I think that focus should be really on violence against women, on gender-based violence against women and girls, because now we are seeing, and this is rightful to have focus on gender equality and how to reach gender equality, but still elimination of all forms of discrimination against women and violence against women, gender-based violence against women and girls should be higher at the UN agenda. We really need to examine those roadmaps like Istanbul Convention today, like CEDAW Convention, a new general recommendation number 35 that was done by CEDAW committee, but my mandate also participated, that is now at the global level, providing roadmap related to elimination of gender-based violence against women and girls. But there is no sufficient promotion of all those instruments. There is no sufficient implementation. And now the question is also, do we need a new optional protocol on violence against women attached to CEDAW in order to have a legally binding roadmap at the level of Istanbul Convention? So there are many things that should be done better. I think that we have to also close this gap between violence against women in peace and during the conflict. Because, for example, on this situation related to definition of rape, how countries are criminalizing rape, we are seeing that, for example, if in a peace situation, there is statute of limitation very, very short of 1 year for prosecuting and reporting rape, then what will happen during the conflict? You are not going to be able to change the definition during the conflict or to do something that is really sending a message. Then violence against women and rape with respect to definitions, with respect to mitigating circumstances. In many states still, rapists could marry a victim and then go free without any prosecution, and such marry the rapist, marry the victim laws should be really changed. And we do not have enough focus on such changes that are essential, that are really crucial. So I hope that in this area of violence against women, in parallel with this agenda to achieve gender equality, we will have also agenda on elimination of violence against women and girls with clear roadmap, what is needed, because in all countries we need to have risk assessment, we need to have shelters, we need to have protection orders, we'll need to have a victim-centered approach to avoid re-victimization during the court processes and so on. We need to have a statute of limitations for rape that are really not precluding women to report rape. So in many states, children victims of rape, girls victims of rape, when they're adults, they could not report such horrible violence because there is statute of limitation. And also I would like to suggest that all states should ratify CEDAW Convention, including United States. So I hope that we will have movement here, that we will have women's marches, and that finally US will join 189 states that have ratified CEDAW.
Thank you, Dr. Simonovic. This question is for both of you. What are some specific things men can do to elevate women so that they can participate fully in society? And what can women do to uplift each other?
Do you want to start, Dr. Simonovic?
Maybe you should start. Yes, please.
Sure. Okay. Sure. So let me start with I guess I'll start with men. I mean, I think it's an important question, and this is, to me, a distinction also as we talk about the participation of women in political life, right? Participation and equality and representation are really important because people bring the experiences that they carry with them. But it doesn't also mean that women are inherently feminist. And I think this is where we can also think about what does it mean to have feminists in positions of power? And that includes men, that includes people on any spectrum of gender, you know, those who are gender nonconforming. There's a larger spectrum of gender than just men and women. And I think as we think about that, we think about the values that feminism holds that's different and not inherent necessarily to being a woman. You know, we do see women in positions of power, and often they're ones who act in ways that are antithetical to violence or antithetical to, you know, to bringing justice and accountability for violence against women or to gender equality. And so I think that, to me, you know, espousing those values is really important. I also think about this in the context of men a lot. We're often faced with, you know, and in the context of last year's election, I suppose I thought a lot about what it means to be, you know, a man as we think about the fight for equality. And I do think there's some things that you can do. You know, I think that President Biden, for example, has done powerful things with appointing strong feminist women to leadership. You know, just today he announced his Gender Equality Council. But I also think about, you know, the context of power sharing. And some of this does mean that men should think about ceding power as an ultimate act of feminism, of stepping out of the way as an important way to also advance, because it's not just rhetorical. When you have a situation, let's look at the United States, where 80% of our national Congress approximately is occupied by men, and who, you know, embody what we think power looks like, who have the, you know, people will vote for you if you've been in a position of power before, right? And so, you know, they have all of these things going for them. And we do need to see some level of ceding of power in order for others, younger people, more diverse people, to be able to take up the mantle. Certainly it's possible through challenging them. But I think that that's one way that men who think of themselves as feminists can do more.
I would agree. Power sharing is very important tool, and now we are not anymore speaking about temporary special measures, about 30% of women. We are speaking about parity, and there are a number of states that are now reaching parity, but there are many more that are far, far away from that parity, that are still not at higher than 20%. So we have to see how to really go in direction of increased political participation of women. From my perspective, I also see generational differences. I see differences between older generation and younger generation. So education is doing a lot, and this sharing of responsibilities between women and men in younger generation is more often than what we had in the past. So I hope that this is a trend that will continue. And also responsibility for violence against women, for all perpetrators, because many of them, violence is not reported. There is no really prosecution, there is impunity. So there are many femicides around the world. And each time when we are posing this question, oh, men are actors or change, they should do this. So they should be really responsible in a way that this is a life-sharing experience. And we need to use all those instruments, human rights instruments, starting from Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was mentioned in a first panel, but also what we have built on this. We have to use Beijing, but also CEDAW, regional instruments. We have to use them not separately, but jointly, in order to have good national action plans and to change all those discriminatory laws and these lacunas that we have at the national level that are still allowing system and patriarchy to stay as it is. So we need younger generation like Akila to shake this world and change it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Simonovic. So we have about 3 minutes left. Any final thoughts or takeaways before my closing?
So I think that it is really important that you're organizing panel like this to have discussions related to violence against women, causes and consequences, and what are key elements that we need to address in order to change our world, in order to move from Me Too to situations in which we are not going to have potentially every woman to say Me Too. So we have to see how all those norms that we have at national level should be changed and should be in line with those human rights standards that we have developed but not really implemented. So I hope that we will have fast implementation of those nice norms, human rights norms that we have developed. Thank you.
I'll add on here because Dr. Simonovich has talked a bit about CEDAW, including the US ratifying CEDAW. So one thing that, I know we've been talking in the context of a global context, but this is largely a US audience. And I'm constantly thinking about the state of gender inequality in the United States, the high rates of violence against women that we have, the fact that the United States doesn't have a unifying framework for combating violence against women, and why one thing that we might also want to think about here in the United States is to think about ratifying and taking seriously treaties like CEDAW and implementing them here in this country. There's a real need, I think, for an American movement for women's rights that looks outside of our boundaries and our borders and says, what can we learn from the way that women in other countries have made progress? Because, the fact of the matter is we don't have that here at home. We have weak legal frameworks in responding to violence. We have weak legal frameworks in protecting fundamental women's rights, including access to abortion. And so I think as I'm looking at the space, I'm someone who works in a global context, but lives here in the United States, and I'm an American. And so I often find this disconnect to be one that is disconcerting, is we'll talk about violence elsewhere, but not do anything about violence here at home. And so I think that's another thought for the audience that we're currently addressing here today.
Thank you. I'll just like to thank Undersecretary General Patton, Dr. Simonovich, and Ms. Radhakrishnan for lending your expertise, your time on such crucial issues regarding the status of women. Your work has elevated the conversation, and I hope it moves us to a globalized standard by which women are truly safe, supported, and afforded the full participation in society and daily life that they deserve. I'd also like to thank the audience for joining us. We hope you enjoyed listening and learning from a panel of such remarkable women. Finally, I'd like to thank the organizers of the conference. Now, please feel free to take a 5-minute break. The conference will resume at 3:40 with a fireside chat with Ms. Reshma Sujani, an activist, founder, and CEO of Girls Who Code, and author of Brave Not Perfect. Once again, my name is Shania Senvelis, and it has been a pleasure moderating this panel. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hello, give me 1 second. Alrighty, perfect. You both have you on. Can we just do a quick audio check for Catherine, please?
Hi.
Perfect. And then Reshma?
Hi.
Perfect.
Great. Sorry, I was just doing one thing.
How are you, Reshma?
Oh, it's been a little bit of a whirlwind today. I think you're like my fifth talk.
Mm-hmm.
So I've lasted.
Well, we're glad you lasted and we're excited for you to be here.
Oh, well, I'm excited. To be here too.
So Kevin, how many more minutes do we have?
You have 5 more minutes until 3:40.
Okay. So Reshma, I have all your books.
That's amazing. I see that.
And I'm wearing a Brave Not Perfect necklace.
Oh,
And I'm drinking from your
look at
mug.
you. Oh,
I'm all ready.
you're all ready. You're like, I'm ready for you.
I'm
Oh,
ready for you. Yes.
that's wonderful.
Yeah. We actually met in Princeton 2 years ago at the Lead Like a Girl conference where you were speaking to like 1,000 girls.
I remember that conference.
Yeah. And I introduced myself because I do a lot of pro bono work with immigrant women and refugee women. And I actually went to your office and met with your international staff to talk about bringing technology to the refugee camps in Iraqi Kurdistan.
Do you know that we went to visit the camps by Afghanistan?
In Afghanistan?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, we'll have to talk about it, but it was really, really powerful. And like, we started really doing some of that work, and then COVID happened.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm on the board of a refugee, an NGO that works with refugee, and technology is a huge, huge focus for us as soon as this COVID passes.
Yeah, it was we went to the ones on the border with Jordan. There's just a huge opportunity.
It is.
Huge, huge opportunity there. So we are now moved our programs virtually. So I feel like it's actually an opportunity for us to even teach even more girls. So we're very excited that, yeah, it's just, I can't even, anyway.
Okay, we're going to get started.
Yes.
Yes. Hello and welcome everyone. Good afternoon for this fireside chat with Reshma Soojani, an attorney, a founder of Girls Who Code and the creator of the Marshall Plans for Moms. Good afternoon, everyone. Her Excellency, the Honorable Ambassador Valentin Ragubica, Honorable Undersecretary and Special Representative Pramila Patten, the New York City Bar Association's President Sheila Boston, distinguished panelists and guests. My name is Catherine Van Kampen. I am a member of the New York City Bar United Nations Committee and African Affairs Committee, as well as the New York State Bar's Association's President's Committee for Leadership Development, all co-sponsoring committees of today's conference. I am an attorney with Bernstein, Litowitz, Berger, and Grossman, a co-sponsor of this event with EPIC and the Huntington National Bank. I am so grateful for the brilliant presentations by this distinguished guests in the first two sessions. Thank you all for the important work you and your organizations do on behalf of all women and girls. A quick plug for the New York City Bar. Anyone watching who is not a member of this venerable organization, I strongly encourage you to become one, because membership will expand your professional opportunities and your awareness of issues and opportunities to get involved and develop your advocacy skills. Dr. Simonovic, your comment about moving beyond Me Too was very pertinent, because the law firm of Bernstein, Litowitz, Berger, and Grossman has a women's initiative and has that is beyond the Me Too initiative, and it's for thought leaderships for policies and laws to protect women in the workforce. I would now like to welcome Reshma Soojani to the second annual International Law Conference on the Status of Women for this fireside chat. Reshma, we are so honored to have you with us today. Reshma, as I was talking to you before, you and I actually met in 2019 at the Lead Like a Girl conference organized by the National Center for Girls Leadership in Princeton, New Jersey at Stork Country Day School. I attended the conference to speak to young girls about becoming a lawyer and advocating for human rights with my dear friend, Konsoli Nishimwa, a Rwanda genocide survivor and author of Tested to the Limit. You and I spoke briefly about the importance of pro bono work with refugee and immigrant women, which is a deep personal and professional commitment of mine. As many of you in the audience know, Reshma Soojani is an unstoppable force for good who has 2 decades of public service, legal, finance, and nonprofit experience. Reshma is a best-selling author of Women Who Don't Wait in Line, Girls Who Code, and Brave Not Perfect. And I hope all of you can see her books behind me. I'm also wearing her necklace, Brave Not Perfect, and I have one of her mugs from her website. So I love you, Reshma.
Oh, Catherine.
Reshma's TED Talk on bravery has 5.4 million views and sparked a vibrant national conversation about how we are raising our girls. In 2010, Reshma surged into the political scene as the first Indian American woman to run for Congress. She has also served as the deputy public advocate for New York City and was a protege of Hillary Clinton. Reshma speaks on a wide variety of topics, including fail first, fail hard, and fail fast, closing the gender gap in tech, women in leadership, democracy, advocacy, gender, youth, and technology. Her nonprofit, Girls Who Code, was awarded Most Innovative Nonprofit by Fast Company. Reshma is a graduate of the University of Illinois, Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, and Yale Law School. Her work on behalf of young women has earned her broad recognition on lists including Fortune's World's Greatest Leaders, Fortune 40 Under 40, the Wall Street Journal's magazine's Innovator of the Year, Forbes' Most Powerful Woman Changing the World, and Fast Company 100 Most Creative Women, among others. She is the winner of the Harold W. McGraw Jr. Prize in Education. Reshma serves on the board of overseers for the International Rescue Committee, which provides aid to refugees and those impacted by humanitarian crisis. In addition, she is also an ex officio trustee of the Museum of Modern Art. Reshma, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. That was very kind of you. I always feel like my dad puts everybody up to it with like all the awards, all the, all the bio, but thank you. Thank you so much.
You are most welcome. So Reshma, I have divided our interview time into 5 parts. And the first part, I would love to know how Reshma became Reshma. Tell us about your formative years and how you became the activist that you are, who you are today.
Well, I think it starts from the thing that both of us are passionate about, my parents being refugees. Both my parents came here from Uganda. They were one of 1,000 refugees who got status to come to this country. They were born in Uganda. 2 generations of their family was there. And one day my father got a letter or was watching television one day and Idi Amin came on and said that you had 90 days to leave the country. Excuse me a minute, cough. Or you'd be shot on spot. So my parents scrambled for refugee status. And ironically, Congressman Koch was the one who was arguing for a bill in Congress to bring in Ugandan refugees. And they became 2 of 1,000 refugees who came here. And even though they were both trained engineers, my mother sold cosmetics. My father worked as a machinist in a plant. And my dad would every night read to me from these Reader's Digest books. And there were these thin books that were about these incredible change makers, like Eleanor Roosevelt, like Dr. King, and I just feel like from a very young age, I know this sounds cheesy, but I wanted to give back to this country that had literally saved my parents' life. And I think seeing their struggle, Catherine, it's like when they came to this country, they didn't speak English very well. And, my father changed his name from Mukund to Mike. My dad would go to Toastmasters every week to try to get rid of his accent. The Catholic charities took them in to, help kind of set them up and get their apartment and, teach them. But they were like 2 20-year-old kids. My mother was pregnant with my sister in this country. And it's always just so remarkable, to think about how much they went through, but also how much love and how much love they have. And now I have, right, for this nation. That's how I think my deep commitment to service has always been so. I mean, I feel very fortunate, right? We say in Hinduism, what's your dharma, right? What do you put on this earth to do? And that has always been very, very clear for me. And I think it stems from them and their struggle.
Mm-hmm. So one of the issues that we have faced in the last 4 years is really the demonization of immigrants and refugees. Hate crimes against Asian Americans are occurring at an alarming rate because the tone at the top of the last administration was essentially to blame Asian Americans for the pandemic. Can you speak to, as an advocate, why it is so important for the tone at the top of every organization to be appropriate and to understand the responsibilities that leaders have with their spoken word and their actions?
Yeah, it matters because we can't go back. I mean, I remember when I was growing up, my house would get TP'd. You know, my house would get spray painted with like, go back to your country. You know, that word, go back to your country, go back to your country, go back to your country. You know, I heard it all the time growing up. And, you know, I remember coming to New York City right after 9/11, and I was doing pro bono while I was working at Davis Polk, helping, you know, young Pakistani families that were being forced to be on, you know, 747s back to Karachi because they were just terrified of just feeling like, wow, we can't go back. We have made too much progress as a nation to embrace people. And we've learned too much about how having people from all different backgrounds makes a difference. But it does matter who people at the top are seeing. You know, I distinctly remember sitting in my family room watching President Reagan give a speech. You know, when you had a president who was using such a xenophobic, racist, hateful language, I mean, little kids were watching. And I know this as the CEO of Girls Who Code, the amount of teachers who would tell me, you know, what was happening in their classroom and the words that were being used and the things that, again, little children were saying. It is like this country taking hundreds of steps, thousands of steps backwards. And so, you know, we have to really, and all of us have to, like, I felt this way at Girls Who Code. I literally took my team and we went to the border of Jordan to start talking to refugee girls to say, what can we do to teach you to code? Like, if our country was going to let them in, I was going to do something about it. You know, when I was the deputy public advocate of New York City, I started the first scholarship program for undocumented students, because at that time, undocumented students didn't get the benefit, you know what I mean, of FAFSA. And so we're left out of college. So I think we constantly have to ask ourselves, you know, what are we doing in our positions, in our of power, in our positions, in our platforms, in our community advocacy, to making sure that we are, you know, committed to our promise that I feel like is just so fundamental to being an American, is being, you know, pro-immigrant.
Right. I think you're 100% correct. I have been on some CLEs and listening to African American lawyers, top lawyers, talk about how you know, they go to the certain towns and they're called sundown towns, where minorities don't really want to be out after dark, and that was just 6 months ago. And I think that when we have a tone at the top from a prior administration where there was pervasive xenophobic, anti-immigrant, not just rhetoric, but policies that emboldened certain parts of our society to engage in violence against immigrants and refugees, I think we have to be very careful and mindful of the tone that we set and the example that we set for others.
And I always say, like, look at me. I could do anything in the world, and I've like dedicated my life to service. And it is because this country saved my parents' life. And every immigrant I know has like I love America more than anybody I know, right? Like, it's like, you know, has that. So the narrative is also just so deeply false and untrue, and not even close to kind of the reality that it's even more important, right, to set the record straight.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but I do want to I am just dying to ask you, because I know you talk about, and I've listened to a couple of your talks, the TED Talk, the Google interview, you talk about the issue that we cannot become what we cannot see.
Yeah.
And so how important is it for you in your lifetime to have seen an African American president, and now we have an American, first African American and Indian American vice president in Kamala Harris?
So important. I mean, like, right, you cannot be what you cannot see. I mean, I also feel like so many of us as people of color and as women, like we diminish our dreams, right? We learn how to give up before we even try, because I'm always checking out when I start a new job, who's at the top, or I get on a board, who's sitting around the table, or I speak at a conference, who's sitting around, because it's almost like an indication of what's possible for you. And unless you're a woman or somebody of color, you may not understand what I'm saying, right? It's like, but it matters now. So many of us who said, well, I can never be president of the United States, or I can never be, now we're like, oh, I could be vice president. Like Kamala's there. You know what
Absolutely.
I mean? Like I can do that too. So many Black people saw Obama and said, you know what, a Black person can have the top job in the world. And so it's game changing for little Black boys and little Black girls. And so it does, these things do really make a huge difference. And then, like, for what I've spent so much of my life doing in terms of entrepreneurship and innovation, you know, I spend every free dollar I have investing in, you know, people of color and women, because we need to make sure that the future companies are created by people who look like us, because that's how things change. That's how ideas are seeded.
Yes, I completely agree with you. 100%. In terms of developing the next generation of advocates and thought leaders, how do you feel? And I think you do a lot of work, like work at Girls Who Code, and you're also an advocate for the girls as they move out of Girls Who Code into corporate jobs. How do you think we can get more young people involved in advocacy for one another and for assisting those in our communities who are very, very vulnerable and really need that partnership?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, see, for me, I led my first march when I was 13. So when I think about, like, when I got to Davis Polk, I was like, okay, how do I sign up for the pro bono work? Right? I always had like my day job and my night hustle.
Right.
And in many ways, like my night hustle was where I filled my moral compass, right? Like I looked for really feeling like again, it's so fundamental. And so and most of the girls that I meet are like, I always say that girls are going to save us, heal us, and change us. So most young people I meet also are looking for that, to tap into that passion and find like that thing that is going to move them, that they are going to fight for. But I do feel like we have to really embed it into our DNA, you know, into the way that we're raising our kids. You know, my son, for the past 4 years, like every Sunday he was making posters because we were going to a march. You know, every weekend there was a group of women sitting around the table talking about what good trouble we were going to get into. And so, you know, he, you know, gets a dollar, gets a toy, and gives it to somebody. But I have raised him to be a little Mahatma Gandhi, you know, and, you know, we will have endless, I mean, it's crazy. We'll have endless conversations. He's 6 about Dr. King. But my dad did that for me. And so, like, I do that for my son. But one of the things that really scares me, you know, in this kind of post-Trump social media moment and cultures, like, we're not embedding those values in our young people. Like, I wanted to be a lawyer because I remember I saw Kelly McGillis in The Accused, and I just thought lawyers were just justice soldiers. And like, I wanted to be like, that was like my view of wanting to be an attorney, because I wanted to make a difference. And so I really do feel like we have to invest, and I got a lot of that out of law school. So like, where's our school, you know, where's our institutions actually teaching those things to our children? You know, how are we embedding that in terms of like what it means to be an American? You know, like that you love one another, we help one another, we are one another's neighbors, you know, and it is that constant, you know, in some ways in this pandemic, right? It was the opportunity for you to see an elderly person who couldn't leave. Are you doing grocery shopping for them? Are you walking their dog? You know what I mean? What are you doing today to help somebody else? You know, and did this pandemic actually get us closer to that sense of empathy and compassion, or further away?
I feel like it's gotten us closer. I hope it has. I think we're having more frank discussions, you know, and hopefully using this crisis to allow the onion to be peeled back so that we don't waste this crisis in, you know, addressing the vulnerabilities in our healthcare systems, our education systems, things that were not, that were known to us before the COVID-19, but were not necessarily put on the front burner. And those are, you know, certainly racial and ethnic, really racism built in, systematically built into some of our government programs, our healthcare programs, and COVID, you know, numbers have a way of telling the truth.
Yep.
And so COVID, when you see the death rates and the hospitalization rates amongst minorities and how adversely they have been impacted, also in the economic, the job market, education, you know, lack of access to the internet in certain communities. I mean, all of these things are something that we need to address immediately. And I hope that this COVID-19 crisis, from a policy standpoint, isn't wasted on our society. But I want to talk to you about Girls Who Code.
Mm-hmm.
And as a woman, you know, one of your themes is be brave, don't be afraid to fail. And you you're the first Indian American woman to run for Congress. And I've read a couple of your books about your race, and how you felt afterwards, and how you turned the fact that you lost into triumph with Girls Who Code. So can you, I think every woman, every person actually has moments in their life where they've failed, and sometimes very high profile failures. So can you talk about kind of picking yourself up and moving forward and building this incredible nonprofit that you have?
Sure. So, I mean, I guess I'll also start with the journey before. I always wanted to go to Yale Law School. Like, in my community, nobody went to like Ivy League schools. Everybody went to University of Illinois-Urbana or community college. And I just had it in my head that if I was going to be a change maker, if I was going to make a difference as a woman of color, I needed that Ivy League degree behind me. So I applied 3 times before I finally got in, you know, and, you know, when I graduated, I was $300,000 in student loan debt. And again, like, I didn't come from I came from a, you know, working class family, and nobody went to law school. So I just kind of did what everybody was doing. And they seemed to be going to these big fancy law firms. And I went for a summer. I remember I got like $20,000. My dad had framed it because he had never seen so much money before, but like, this was the American dream. And even though I knew what I really wanted to do was go work for the NAACP, go work in government, go run for office, I thought naively, like, oh, I'll go work at Davis Polk and I'll pay off my loans in like a year or two, and then I can go do what I really want to do. Because no one could talk to me about like the loan forgiveness amazing program that Yale Law School had. And I actually didn't need to do that. Like, I could go do the thing I wanted to do. And like, but anyway, $300,000 in student loan debt. And 10 years later, I'm not at Davis Polk, but I'm in corporate law, and I hate it. And I am miserable. And now I'm like 31, 32. And I'm like, is this it? Is this my life? And I think for me, because I knew exactly what I was meant to do in my life, at 30, being so far away from that destiny was really just gut-wrenching. And I remember my best friend called me, and it's funny how your best friend always calls when your life is falling apart. And I remember Deepa just saying, just quit. And there was nothing about what she said, but no one had given me that profession and permission before. And because I was this perfect immigrant girl who was paying my parents' mortgage and taking care of them and helping my sister, like, it's just, I didn't feel like I had the freedom to go do something for me. And I remember calling my father, and he said, just quit. And then I quit, and I decided to run for United States Congress because I was like, why not? Right? Like, and I ran against, you know, an 18-year incumbent. You know, I basically did what Ocasio did, except before it was cool. I remember I was the only Democrat to ever primary a Democrat that entire cycle. I mean, you just did not do. Now it's like everybody's primarying everybody. But
Right.
back then it was like nuts. And I just didn't know any better. And I thought I would shake every hand and meet every voter. And, you know, I convinced a whole lot of people to support me. I had John Legend do not one, but two concerts for me. I mean, and I remember on election day, I swore I was going to win, you know, because I'd stand there on the subway stops and people would be like, I voted for you. I voted for you. And of course, now I learned that everyone just says that, even if they didn't. But I got crushed on election day. I mean, less than 19% of the vote. I didn't even have a concession speech in my bag. And I knew that everybody was laughing at me, that like, you know, that the Democratic Party was pissed that I didn't wait my turn.
Mm-hmm.
And when I woke up the next morning, the thing that I realized was that, you know, I'm not broken. Like I'm not broken. Like I had thought for so long that if you went after your biggest dream and that if it didn't work out, that it would literally physically break you. And that was why for so long I had just like given up before I even tried, and why I think so many of us give up before we even try. And so it was this huge aha moment that like I could go after the thing that I've wanted my whole life and it could not work out. And I could like live to like fight another day. And like, what are the other things that I've talked myself out of? And to be honest, it's what gave me the bravery to start a movement to teach girls to code when I didn't code and I didn't even bother to learn. And I want all the lawyers in this room to like, because I know I know us, because I'm like, I am what I am, one was one. And we feel so stuck in our careers because we think we only know how to do this thing. And I realized that like, you know, being an attorney, like I know how to problem solve. I know how to go from point A to point B. Like I actually really know how to write, you know, that business plan of how to kind of think it through. And that's actually a gift.
Mm-hmm.
And so like, I am actually very much suited. We as lawyers are very much suited towards being entrepreneurs. And that you don't have to be an expert in the thing that you want to start. You just got to have passion. And that was like a, you know, like a wow, like, you know, a huge aha moment for me. And I think it was very much led to even now, like, you know, I just a couple months ago had an idea for a Marshall Plan for moms. And I, you know, I threw out that number, $2,400 a month. And, you know, when it blew up, everyone's, you know, these, you know, I'll call them haters. We're like, well, did you talk to a lawyer? Did you talk to an economist? And I was like, no, and I don't need to. You know what I mean? And it was, again, it was because I learned 10 years ago that like, I don't have to fact check everything, meaning like, I don't have to fact check my vision.
Right.
Let me be very clear about that, right? It's like men do this all the time. They have a big idea. They'll tell you like how their, you know, sticker company is going to become $1 billion business. And we won't even, you know, I'm still counting every girl I taught because I don't want to like say that it's, you know, 305,000 instead of 300,000, because then I won't be being honest. And it's, those are the things, right, that like hold us back.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's absolutely beautiful, and I think the way that you developed Girls Who Code, and then this whole notion of bravery and bringing on a bravery revolution and trying to rethink, have us women as women and how we condition our girls, thinking that, you know, we don't have to be perfect, we just have to be brave. And one of the things that I want to just commend you on for Girls Who Code is, and I've heard you say it a couple of times, how you really want to go into the poorest of the poor neighborhoods. You want to go into vulnerable and underserved communities. I really commend you for that, because I think what we're seeing in society today is kind of is actually the compound effect of resources that are concentrated in the hands of the very few and very wealthy, and it's almost like 90% of the resources are going 10% to 10% of the of the community, when it's really that 90% of the community, you know, they need the resources and they're deprived of those resources. So the beauty of what you're doing with Girls Who Code and going into, you know, vulnerable communities, inner city, underserved communities, refugees, it's really commendable.
I appreciate it. And listen, the thing is the reality is, and I think this is the power of making your own destiny, is nobody told me to do that. You know, when I started Girls Who Code, I said half the girls I teach are going to be under the poverty line and Black and Latina. Because I knew that less than 1% of female engineers were Black. And so, and I knew that I would have to build an entire operation to go recruit Black and Latina girls. And if I could design a program for them, I could teach everybody. It's why I went and visited refugee camps 2 years ago, because if I could teach refugee girls, we can teach anybody.
Right.
And that's what I try to tell people is, and I think as lawyers, we're very curious people. And so we like to problem solve. So that's also where I'm the most intellectually satisfied, and where I'm the most satisfied as the daughter of refugees is like, I want to teach the girls who everybody have counted out, because that was me. And those are the girls that I knew. And the same thing happened, you know, when COVID-19 hit and all of our programs were decimated, right? Because we taught girls in technology companies that were shut down, in schools, 10,000 Girls Who Code clubs across the country, schools that were closed, colleges that were shut down. And, you know, as we built a virtual program, like my team and I said, okay, how do I build a summer camp that's virtual, that is for a girl of color who's living in a homeless shelter, who doesn't have Wi-Fi, who might only have one device, that it's an essential worker, and that's taking care of sibling? How do I build a synchronous and asynchronous program for her that by the end, she has completed it and thrived? And we figured it out, and we did it. You know what I mean? And like now we're blowing it up. We're teaching 6,000 girls this year. So like, and everybody's a best in class, best program that we've ever worked with and seen. And I think that's the thing. You start with the hardest, the communities that people have counted out. That's where you start. And that's the thing that I've learned. It's the same thing I'm doing again with mothers right now. It's like, nobody wants to help mothers, right? Like at all. And it's crazy, even though 86% of women under the age of 45 have child, but we are the most unseen, unrespected, unvalued constituency out there.
Right. Well, I want to go back real quick to the brave, not perfect, because I just want to say this to you. Because I've heard you say in some of your talks that you weren't brave until your 30s. But I don't really think that's true. I think that as a child, when you were being discriminated against and someone, you know, you were beat up and you chose to stand up to those kids and then start a club to, you know, work against discrimination in your elementary school, in your high school, and then college. I think you've always been brave, and you're certainly a wonderful example for every attorney listening today, as well as every person in our country. And I do want to, so let's go to the Marshall Plan for Moms and how COVID, we've talked a lot earlier today about violence against women, but can you talk to us about this she session that we're in? Women, moms in particular, are being crushed. I believe there's 2.5 million moms who've left the workforce. So can you frame this out for us and tell us what's going on here?
Yeah, so, you know, moms are getting crushed in the pandemic. You know, 2.4 million women have left the workforce. Our labor market participation is where it was in 1989. So we lost, you know, 30 years of progress essentially in 9 months, which is terrifying. And that happened for two major reasons. First, because of the instability of schools created a childcare crisis. So daycares are closed, schools are closed. You're now working in retail, or you're a substitute teacher and you have to homeschool your child. You know what I mean? And you don't have anyone to take care of your kid, nor can you afford it, right? So that, for a lot of women, you know, either pushed them out of the workforce, had them reduce their hours, had them go on food stamps, you know, had them move in with their families, right? And then the second reason why you're seeing this decline of women in the labor market is because many women found themselves in jobs that weren't pandemic-proof. Retail, healthcare, education, and many of these jobs are simply not coming back. So when we started the pandemic, we were 51% of the labor force. Again, now we're where we're at in like 1989. And so, what I've called for is a 360 plan, to get mothers back to work. And that includes, monthly short-term payments for mothers. When I proposed this, everyone said it was a crazy idea, but guess what? We've passed the child care tax credit.
Yes.
Which I would argue is a down payment on the Marshall Plan. But we're recognizing that we have to put cash in the hands of parents so that they can actually then make choices that they need to make for their family.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, we got to pass paid leave and affordable childcare. Before COVID, we were on a 12. We didn't get it in this bill. So we got to fight for it in the Recovery Act. But paid leave is fundamental. Quite honestly, we might not have lost so many of our countrymen if we had paid leave, because a lot of people in March, April, May found themselves sick and they went to work,
right,
because they didn't have paid leave.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have a daycare. We don't have an affordable childcare system.
Right.
I was a latchkey kid. Do you remember that term?
Mm-hmm.
And because my parents couldn't afford childcare, my dad would hide the key underneath, the mat in the house. And from middle school, I would come home and let myself in, and the television was my babysitter because they couldn't afford it. So, again, and then finally, it's just really the retraining. We are we don't live in a society where it's really tenable for you not to have in a 2-income household.
Right.
And so like this kind of 1950s sensibility isn't even actually a reality. And so a lot of women have lost their jobs, and we can't let them fall into poverty. And so many of them already have. And so what are we going to do to retrain them? What are we going to do to get them back into the labor force? And so that's a Marshall Plan for Moms. And we have 2 bills already introduced in Congress in 4 weeks. Grace Meng introduced the Marshall Plan for Moms in the House. Senator Klobuchar and Senator Duckworth introduced a Marshall Plan for Moms in the Senate. There are bills being introduced all across the country right now. So, we've made a tremendous amount. We've made some progress, but we still have a lot of work to do.
I think I also commend you for, having just the vision to be able to frame out the issue with regard to your Marshall Plan for moms. We do know that communities of color, particularly African American and Latina communities, those women have been 3 to 4 times just decimated.
Decimated.
Yeah, and it's catastrophic because women in general, we work for shorter periods of time than men, which means that our income, ability to earn income is shorter. We have less savings.
Yep.
We have more of the childcare responsibilities at home. Even if you have a partner who helps, we still have the burden at home. So I think that if this crisis can help us generate a conversation and create public policy that supports and safeguard women both physically as well as economically, we can make a lot of progress.
Yeah. You're right. And look, 70% of low-income households are run by a single breadwinner, which is a mother, and normally a mother of color. Mm-hmm. So when she lost her job, the entire family suffered. And so it is made an enormous, so your Black women are getting hit by the economic crisis, are getting hit by COVID, right? Are getting hit by the education system, which, their children are not getting, Wi-Fi, digital devices, the remote learning. It is a crisis like we have never seen, for communities of color that are literally getting hit on every single side. And so we have to do something. And we can't lose, we're losing time. We have to do something now.
Right. Well, I commend you again for the vision that you've had with regard to the Marshall Plan for Moms. Maybe we can have a Million Mom March at some point supporting this and more pro-female policies at every government level. Reshma, I want to close because this is such an important issue to me. Last year, I was selected to attend Tory Burch's Embrace Ambition Summit. And you had to write an essay to get picked. And I wrote about my love for pro bono work and working with refugee women. And I was literally stunned when she opened the conference Tory Burch got up and said that we are now facing the worst refugee crisis since World War II. There are now 80 million persons displaced around the world. And one question I have for you as a visionary is why doesn't the world see this as the catastrophic crisis that it is? Why don't more people care? And my third question is, why don't we see, if refugees and immigrants were a commodity, I would invest in them immediately, because refugees and immigrants, they come to their new countries. They want to work, they want to provide for their families, and they want to build a new life. And they have that hustle and that love of country that it is astonishing to me that that whole aspect of the contributions that refugees and immigrants make is completely lost on some people. I just really don't understand it. So do you have any, being the child of refugees, do you have any insight on this?
I mean, you know that line, like, if it were not for the grace of God, she could have been I.
Mm-hmm.
In this sense of how fortunate, like, we sit here in this country, and the things that we have and the opportunities that we have, and what our obligation is as a nation to be the moral compass. You know, it was always, every day I would think through Trump that if Edie and me were in power today, that my parents would not have been able to come to this country. They would have not gotten refugee status, and I would have never, ever started Girls Who Code or done any of the things that I've been doing.
Right.
And how do you communicate that to so many Americans who don't think, right, that we should be letting in refugees? And that's also a new shift.
Right.
Because it wasn't that way in the 1970s when my parents came here. So again, it goes back to, like, what are we teaching our children? What are the values that we're instilling in school? What is our obligation as a country? I am hopeful with this administration that we are, again, I'm really hopeful.
Yeah, me too.
You know, that we're again, I mean, I sit on the board of IRC. I cannot tell you how devastating it is to hear those numbers and to hear how many children are, like, going to die because we just didn't stand up. So I think we just have to recenter this issue and have to keep talking about it. And so much of it was, and we talk about this at RCL, is it storytelling? You know, one of the ways I built Girls Who Code was by sharing their stories. And do we just need to keep sharing the stories of what's happening globally? And that's why I just worry that this crisis has made its focus too inward. You know, and like, was there a moment to start looking again globally, and now we've lost that opportunity? But yeah, it is devastating.
I want to also ask you about something I call the trilogy of horrors, that I had hoped in this century we would not be seeing such horrific violence against women and girls like we have with the Boko Haram girls, the Yazidi girls, Rohingyans, the Uyghur women. What is it that we are missing in public policy that we are not keeping women and girls, children safe?
We don't invest in women and girls. I mean, last year through COVID, I literally had to rebuild my organization from scratch. Not one person called me and said, do you need something? Can I send you a check? What resources do you need? Nobody. I literally had to, like, do it by myself with my team. And it was such a, and we ended up stronger than ever, but that took every bit and ounce of my soul to do it, every favor, every call. And so there isn't an infrastructure that is built in by philanthropists, by wealthy people that are like, we are going to support women and girls. In fact, we are the least funded, the least supported in the first. I mean, I don't even want to know how many women and girls organizations shut down during this pandemic. Thousands, I'm sure. And so there's no infrastructure to support them because we don't really respect women and girls. Like, let's be honest, and again, what's happened in this pandemic to women, to mothers, to girls. I mean, nobody was thinking about, well, if we shut down the schools, there's so many girls that are abused, every day. What's going to happen to them? Or how many women are facing domestic violence? What's going to happen to them? Like locking them up in their homes is literally devastating, right? But that didn't even occur to people when they came up with this proposal. It's the same thing. And like, are people, I would love to know whether any mayor, any governor in the state has been actually looking at who's logging on and who's logging off and what's the gender disparity of that. I guarantee you it's affecting girls more than it's affecting boys. And that's across the globe. Who's doing more housework right now? Girls, right? Like, I mean, this is like, again, this economic crisis has completely set back women and girls enormously in ways. And we have to ask ourselves, well, why? Because we don't invest resources in them. We don't think about them.
Go ahead. Sorry. So Reshma, unfortunately, my time with you is up, but do you want to leave us with a parting message? How can we be a force for good?
Well, listen, I feel like we're warriors, right? Female lawyers are warriors, and all of us kind of have our day jobs, but then we have things that we are really passionate about and that we're caring about. And right now, I do feel like as women, as mothers, we have to tap into that populist rage and fight for what we want. And to accept that many of the institutions that we're in, whether it's our homes or whether it's our law firms, have not made the progress that they should have made, and to push. And part of that means we have to let go of the perfectionism and not matter if people like us, and say the really tough things, and say the truth, even when we know that there's probably a price to pay for that. And I think secondly, it's also just as many of us, I mean, I'm 45, right? It's like I'm getting to the middle-ish. We're all getting to like parts of our careers where we're like, what's the point? Like, if anything that this pandemic showed us is life is short. There's a lot of injustice to fight. And like, we might as well as get real loud.
Well, thank you, Reshma, for joining us today. We're going to turn this over to Epic and the Huntington Bank for a short award ceremony.
Oh, thank you. I have my thing downstairs. Okay, great.
I will leave this audience with my personal motto, and that is to go out and use your precious time and your unique talents to do a world of good. Thank you so much.
Okay, hi everybody. My name is Victoria Wachora. I'm with Epic. We're one of the proud sponsors here of today's event. And I wanted to just welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming, and happy International Women's Day to everyone who's here. I'm honored and humbled to be part of this amazing program today. And I've been really moved by all of the panelists and their commitment to promoting gender equality. As a single mom to a 9-year-old daughter, I'm particularly grateful to these women for their contributions in fostering equal opportunities for future generations of women. Epic is a proud sponsor of this event for now the 2nd year in a row, and I couldn't be more happy to work at a company that is global, that empowers and promotes deserving women, and fosters an environment for inclusion, and gives us an open forum to openly discuss women's issues. So with that, I'm proud to present this year's Epic Women Awards to Pramila Patton, Under Secretary General and the United Nations Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence, Dubravka Simonovic, United Nations Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, Taina Bien-Ami, Executive Director of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, and Beata Andres, International Labor Organization Special Representative to the United Nations. Ladies, on behalf of myself, Epic, Huntington Bank, Bernstein Litowitz Berger and Grossman, and the New York City Bar, Thank you for all of your hard work and dedication towards improving the status of women globally. Please join me in congratulating these women on their significant achievements. And now I'll turn it over to Robin Griffin at Huntington Bank, who will present the Her Heroes Awards. Robin.
Thank you. So thank you, everyone. So I'm Robin Griffin, and I am a Senior Managing Director with Huntington National Bank. And along with EPIC, I am so pleased to be sponsoring this event for the second year in a row, and to be a part of such an important program on such an incredible day on International Women's Day. And I too also feel super proud to be part of an organization that values and supports such critical issues for women related to equality, opportunity, and so much more. So with that, in the interest of time, I would like to honor the honorees this year for this year's Huntington Her Hero Award Lifetime Achievement Awards to Sheila S. Boston. Sheila is the president of the New York City Bar and a litigation partner at Arnold, Porter, Kay, and Scholler LLP. Rashma Sujani, who is the founder and CEO of Girls Who Code and so much more, as we just heard with Catherine. Ambassador Valentine Ragwa Biza, who is the Rwanda's permanent representative to the United Nations since 2016. And finally, Akila Raha Krishnan, who is the president of the Global Justice Center. So congratulations for all that you do, and so well deserved on those Lifetime Achievement Awards. So with that, I wanted to thank everyone and the organizers of this event today, Catherine Van Kampen, the New York City Bar Association, Bernstein, Litowitz, Berger, and Grossman, the UN Committee, and the African Affairs Committee, for hosting this terrific conference today. The speakers today continue to bring to light very important issues, and they are an inspiration to all of us for their incredible dedication and their championing of their issues. And to quote what Rashma just said, are warriors out there. So again, thank you and happy International Women's Day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.